De las jornadas que organiza el doctor Cáceres, en buena medida del área de Filosofía del Derecho. Y en esta ocasión, gran parte de la sesión del día de hoy por la mañana, tenemos la fortuna de contar con varios profesores del extranjero, muy amigos del Instituto, todos ellos, para continuar con la discusión y que tiene que ver con un tema relevante para la revista Problema, y con eso vamos a dar inicio el día de hoy. En primer término, tengo el gusto de presentar al doctor Jeffrey Heinrich. Él es licenciado en Derecho por la Universidad de Georgetown, hizo su doctorado en Filosofía en la Universidad de California, Los Ángeles. Tiene una estancia y estudios postdoctorales en la Universidad de Harvard y actualmente él es profesor en la Universidad de California en Irvine. Tiene un puesto tanto en el Departamento de Filosofía como en la Facultad de Derecho. Jeffrey, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. It's an honor to have you here in Mexico City, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you for inviting me. It's an even bigger honor to be here. So, I will try to live up to the introduction, with most of which I understood. So, the usual thing that I learned when I first studied philosophy, and just what I thought was common sense ethics, common sense practice, was that, as Kant once argued, you don't have to be responsible for the truth. You don't have an obligation to be accurate so that what you say corresponds to what is true in the world. The only obligation you really have is to be sincere and to infer reasonably from the evidence, which is, in other words, to speak what we would ordinarily call responsibly, honestly, and with some degree of careful inferences. So carefully responsible, but if it turns out, based on the best care and best sincerity and the best effort, what you say happens not to correspond to reality. You say it's raining and you're actually in a movie set. But there's no way you can. You're not considered in the least bit liable. We're not liable, responsible for the truth. We're just responsible for being truthful, sincere. Right? Or so I thought. Then I studied law, right? And in a variety of legal contexts, this is not, this simple common sense morality that was not held at all. Kant's constraint doesn't apply at all. In certain kinds of affidavits, certain kinds of contracts, and especially in the laws of commercial advertising, parties are regularly held not only to being sincere and careful in what they say, but in being actually objectively accurate. When a product proclaims on its packaging, and at least in the United States, Japan, England, a lot of countries, I'm pretty sure Mexico, but you can correct me, but in a lot of countries, when a product proclaims on its packaging 0% sugar, or absolutely BPA-free lining, or absolutely caffeine-free, and it turns out the product has caffeine, has sugar, has BPA, the company or the agent that put this expression into practice is held responsible, is held liable, is reasonably answerable in some sense, or responsible for having spoken inaccurately. The normal excuse that you and I might have if we spoke inaccurately, for example, we tried our best, that was what the research suggested at the time, that was what my senses gave me, doesn't work. Right? It doesn't matter why the company believed it was caffeine-free. If it turns out not to be, the company is in fact responsible, even if it's in a commercial. These at least applies to factual statements, evaluative statements like the best coffee in, the American coffee. That's not necessarily going to be held to accuracy. But caffeine-free, or any kind of what's considered, according to the Lanham Act, which is the one of the statutes of the United States that deals with this topic, any factual claim in product advertising or in a lot of corporate speech is held to be accurate, not merely sincere, not merely careful. And when you mention this, especially to philosophers, say, well, we know this already. This is one of those cases where the law says one thing and ethics or ordinary common sense morality says something else. And that's quite, some people think, you might hear a panelist who thinks it with certain kinds of contracts law. You say, well, contract says this, promise says that. Not necessarily anomalous. Right? So you might think that the sort of strict liability for accuracy that the law assigns in cases of things like commercial representation is just one of those cases where parties have to be held responsible or held accountable as a legal practice, but it doesn't reflect our moral intuitions, or it doesn't reflect morality necessarily. What I want to propose here is that, in fact, it does reflect morality, and that, in fact, there is a perfectly coherent moral justification, a moral account to be made for this kind of strict liability for accuracy. And it comes from a kind of speech act that we do that is commonly, it's familiar enough when you hear about it, but is not very much discussed in philosophy or, for that matter, in speech act theory. And that is the act of word giving, what I'm calling word giving. And in that, I'm grouping the family of speech acts like, I give you my word that P, I give you my word the building is empty, so blow it up. I give you my word that absolutely nobody knows of your secret. But you might, similar locutions like I promise that it's the case. We don't say I promise to, but I promise that. Right? I promise this here has no dairy. Or I promise I wasn't in the room yesterday. I promise I didn't tell anybody this. Right? I promise that something is the case. I guarantee you that something is the case. Or I give you my word that something is true. It turns out these are speech acts quite outside, not necessarily limited to legal context. In fact, they predate any of the legal context that I discussed. But they are, as a matter of ethics, or at least many people think, since Judith Thomson discussed, probably the only philosopher to discuss this category, many people believe that such speech acts, like their legal counterparts, or their legal instances, are held to accuracy and not just sincerity and care. If I tell you, this has no caffeine, you say, really? I know you think so, but are you sure? Because I'm allergic. I say, I guarantee it. It actually has no, not just my opinion. It's a fact. I guarantee you, no caffeine. And you drink it, and you start bouncing around, and you're all wild and lively. You can actually hold me accountable. You can actually say, hey, you guaranteed no caffeine. Well, I thought there was no caffeine. I asked the salesperson. Doesn't matter. You can actually hold me responsible. If I tell you so-and-so was in my house during the time of the murder, well, I know you saw him. No, he actually did. He could not have done it. I guarantee you. Right? So when I add phrases like I guarantee you, or no, I promise he wasn't, or I promise it doesn't, when I add those phrases, suddenly I'm held not merely to expressing the best of my opinion, senses, evidence, but I'm held to be actually objectively correct. Morally, not legally, not necessarily legally. Or so I'm claiming. Now, some of you may doubt this. You may think that's very hardcore. So since what I plan to do is account for why this is the case, for those who doubt that it's the case, you can simply say, okay, he's going to give an argument for it. Because the account for it, the explanation for why this happens will serve simultaneously as an argument for this kind of moral strict liability, which I will then claim justifies the legal strict liability, since they are instances of the moral kind, which is to say they're instances of guarantees promising that and speech acts. Now, what exactly do I mean by guaranteeing, besides all these examples like I guarantee you it's true, I promise it's true? So I'm describing, to individuate this class of speech acts, I want to use three characteristics just to mark them off from other kinds of speech. The first is that they assert a proposition, and they're like other assertions, right? So this product contains no BPA, there was nobody in the building, I guarantee you, right? It asserts a proposition. Second, and this is important, the claim is presented as known and not as an opinion. So the fact that it's more than just my assessment is part of the very presentation of the claim. That means that if I added, for example, no caffeine, I checked, or I'm pretty sure, or, it really doesn't feel that way to me. I'm very good at knowing these things. Those kind of qualifiers actually change the meaning. They change the meaning of the declaration, right? Then I'm giving you a very good reason to believe what I believe, and even explaining why it is I believe it so strongly. When I give you my word, it's a different kind of speech act entirely. I'm saying, no, forget assessments, forget evaluations, forget opinion. This is actually a fact. Right? And in so doing, the third characteristic, so it's presented as knowledge, the third characteristic is that I seek and expect deference from you as to the truth. So when I give you my opinion, I hope to persuade you, I hope to share my opinion with you so that you may take it up yourself, but it's an opinion that I invite you in a way to hold open to all the scrutiny and checking you might have. I hope you won't second guess me. I'd be insulted if you doubted, I'm certain that Trump's going to lose or something like that. I'd be insulted if you doubted, but I'm not actually seeking or expecting that you close off further examination, that you rule out the possibility that maybe new evidence may come up, maybe some other factors might. In fact, if I'm confident, I'm providing my own opinion as evidence for you to take as evidence, for you to use in your inferential and doxastic practices. Not so with guarantees or word giving. With guarantees or word giving, I'm inviting you to, or expecting you, to defer to me, to close off the matter, or at least to be licensed, to permit yourself to close off the matter for further scrutiny and reassessment. Once I give you my word this contains no caffeine, I give you my word that the bomb is deactivated, I'm licensing you and expecting you to take yourself to be licensed to close off further worry or concern about whether it's true. The investigation is over. And that is another difference from ordinary assertions, even very strong assertions. So if I provide evidence for my word giving, it's done, it's closed, I checked, or it's done, so-and-so told me and they're very reliable. It's no longer a word giving. I'm not seeking deference. I'm giving you evidence, thereby inviting your scrutiny instead of closing it off. So that's what a word giving, as I'm describing it, is. It has these characteristics. And again, they're quite familiar. Some of them are dramatic, the bomb is safe, and some of them are rather mundane, like a newspaper article says, the tectonic plate has stopped moving for the next has stopped moving decisively, no more movement in the plate. Or the drought continues despite efforts to stop it. Right? These are dry, literally dry, arid statements, no emphasis, of no moment, in fact, but are nevertheless, Napoleon had exactly 428 hairs on his head. It's a fact. Nothing turns on it, but it's a fact. But again, it's not presented as an opinion, and it's presented for you to close off, to defer to me as the authority or as somebody who has taken care of the question of whether it turned out to be true. Closed. That's a word giving. And what I'm claiming about these word givings, so defined, is that we are reasonably held responsible for their accuracy. That's to say, if I give you my word that something is true and it turned out not to be true, I'm answerable to you for it. What do I mean by responsible? I mean the familiar case of bearing the burdens of wrongdoing. So I mean, I am at least presumptively liable for some redress if I harmed you with the word giving. I owe a full-out, real apology, and for here I'm distinguishing apologies for wrongdoing from apologies that kind of excuse me or pardon me for an accident, a blameless accident. I owe outright apology. If I give you my word and I'm inaccurate, I owe an apology. I am, morally speaking, your delinquent. Right? I'm answerable to you for it. I'm the first address for actually repairing or addressing the harm. These may be shifted. There may be insurance involved. There may be all kinds of categories where I might not have to fully compensate or fully make up for it. But I am responsible in the sense of having wronged you if I give you my word and it's inaccurate. The question, again, is why or how can that be the case? And there's reasons to be puzzled by it, even though hopefully I find it not too controversial. And puzzle, as with regular promissory obligation, is we can't do better than offer our best estimate, our best guess. I can't do better than look at the evidence and express my sense of it to the best of my abilities. So how can I be held responsible for more? Why can we be reasonably held responsible for not only trying our best and acting in good faith, but being accurate? And it's the kind of puzzle, if some of you familiar with the work of Tim Scanlon, Joseph Raz on promises, it's the kind of puzzle that others have raised, in Raz's case with the aim of answering it, about other moral strict liability cases. If I tell you that I plan to be so-and-so in such a place, I will be at the party tonight, I will be at the airport today at 3 o'clock, I'm held to just intending to be there. But if I add the word I promised, even if I have no further basis except to plan and to intend, I must actually be at the airport. Right? Same kind of moral strict liability. I'm responsible that the world fit what I say about it, in this case, the future world. And it raises there, as here, a puzzle, because all we can express is either our intentions about our future actions or our assessments, our evaluations about facts. Nevertheless, we're held strictly liable. Why might that be? So the familiar answers in the literature are reliance and assurance theory. Reliance theory is common in contract theory. Reliance theory for this question was, again, and the only discussion of it in philosophy was Judith Thomson. And Judy's answer was that when you give your word that something is the case, including when you promise, you invite people to act on it, which is how she defines reliance. Right? If I promise you I'm going to be at the airport, you can now plan around it. You can hold a secret meeting to badmouth me because I won't be there. You can meet me at the place I promised to be. Or whatever it is, you're now licensed to act on it. And as a consequence, when you accept my invitation to act on it, to rely on it, you thereby acquire a claim against me that I actually be accurate, that I be right. And that's considered a moral claim, a moral reason why I'm answerable, responsible to you for the falsity. It's almost as though by inviting you to act on what I do, I overcome the ordinary constraints that I only have to act in good faith, I only have to try hard. Once I invite you to act on it, it's too late. I'm now responsible for more than just my best efforts. I have to be right, because you're acting on it. That's her answer. And so you might think that applies to these factual declarations. I guarantee you, right, no caffeine, I guarantee you no sugar. The problem with this answer is that word givings, as I've described it, guarantees as I've described it, are in fact broader in scope than these relational cases that Thompson talks about. In many cases of word giving, there is nobody whom we invite, there is nobody who accepts the invitation, and there is nothing to rely on, necessarily. A veterinarian says dogs who died of a certain kind of illness didn't actually suffer in the final minutes. They don't actually suffer from pain. That's just a forensic scientific count. But the veterinarian says, not just my assessment, I guarantee it's a fact. Right? That's a word giving. It turns out false, they're responsible. But they're not inviting anyone in particular. They could broadcast it on the radio. And there's nothing to do about it. There's nothing to act on. Or I might say, in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in Manhattan in the 1920s, whenever it was, it turns out that people died of debris and not of asphyxiation. That's a fact. Again, a forensic, historical statement. No particular recipient, no audience, and no reliance. But it's a word giving. If inaccurate, if a textbook that you read is inaccurate, if advertising with no particular moment or consequence, right? This product was made in a basement in Philadelphia. Nothing to do about it. It just kind of makes it quaint. It makes it authentic. Doesn't matter, right? You're responsible. So Thompson's answer, the inviting reliance answer, is problematic because it is simply underbroad. Even if she's right, that generates an obligation. It doesn't apply to many, in fact, some of the most interesting cases of word giving. The alternative answer that you can extract from the promises literature comes originally from T.M. Scanlon. Scanlon's view is that the reason it's wrong to promise falsely, and you can infer it's wrong, his reasons apply to word giving as well, is that you assure someone of a truth, and it's wrong to generate in someone a state of assuredness, or it's wrong to try to generate in someone a state of assuredness that something is the case when it's not. I give you an assurance. I make you believe it, and it's not true. But this doesn't work either because of the familiar counterexample of persuasive assurance. When I assure you in almost all cases where I try to convince you of something, I'm doing precisely what Scanlon describes, which is I'm trying to get you to believe something with certainty, to believe it strongly. And there, too, I am held accountable if it is inaccurate. Right? There, too, I'm not held accountable. In other words, it's not like word giving. If I give you my persuasive opinion that something is the case, trust me, this is the best potion. It works. I've tried it 1,000 times. Or trust me, my friend didn't do the crime. He didn't do what you're accusing him of. I know him for 20 years. He didn't do it. And I work hard to get you to be sure, to believe. I'm doing exactly what Scanlon says, but nobody would say that in that case I'm held liable for accuracy. I'm held liable strictly for the truth. It turns out that I tried my best. I had good reasons to believe my friend was innocent. I had motivations to believe it. It turns out that I was acting in good faith. I have an excuse, and I'm completely, usually, I'm not held liable. I might be in some cases, right? They might parallel the strict liability of word giving. But the mere fact that I'm trying to get you to believe something, even to be sure of it, doesn't generate strict liability in cases of persuasive assurance. Doesn't have to. And that's enough to show that assurance is not the answer here. So what is the answer? I'll say very quickly because I don't want to run out of time. I don't know how we're doing.
We're good.
But here's what I'm claiming is distinctive about word giving. I think what's distinctive about it helps us show why it does generate strict liability in both the moral and the legal cases. One of the differences, and I mentioned this in the beginning, one of the characteristics of word giving that separates it from assertions, or what epistemologists call assurances, one of the key distinctions is that a word giving, as I said, solicits your deference to me, solicits your closing off the matter for further scrutiny. In other words, I solicit your presumption. A presumption is different from belief, it's different from acceptance. It's an entirely different thing altogether. A presumption is a license you have, right? A presumption is the absence of checking or rechecking. It's taking something as true for purposes of shifting your epistemic burden to other matters, right? Your license not to revisit, not to examine, not to scrutinize, right? You can presume. Presuming doesn't mean you believe it, doesn't mean you accept it. It's the practice of not subjecting this to further scrutiny if you have no doubt. It's kind of a weak thing when you think about it. It's automatic. It can be automatic. It can be unconscious, right? And the most familiar case is when a person expresses a belief, right? What's the best way to downtown Mexico City? Straight that way. You don't think I'm lying, but you have very little evidence that I'm not lying when I say that. Which way is the restroom? It's that way. You're licensed to simply take that, to presume that that is the case, that I'm at least speaking, I may be wrong, but you're licensed to presume I'm speaking sincerely, right? That license is undetermined by the evidence, and it's not a reason to believe I'm sincere. At least I'm claiming there are epistemologists who say it is. I'm saying, at the very least, you're licensed to take it as true for purposes of moving on to other matters, not rechecking, not revisiting. You can let your epistemic guard down with respect to whether I'm being sincere. It's a presumption, and it's a reasonable presumption. And I want to say that with word giving, not only do I solicit a presumption that I know what I'm saying, I guarantee you this product is safe. Not only do I solicit your presumption that I know it, but the presumption, as with sincerity in ordinary assertions, the presumption is reasonable. You may reasonably and without epistemic defect presume, take that when I give you my word that it's true. And there's reasons why we have this presumption in place. I want to suggest it's the same reasons that we have the ordinary presumptions of sincerity with regular speech. So with regular speech, I say, the kitchen's that way. I say, it's raining, or whatever it is. The reason you presume that I'm speaking sincerely, that I'm expressing my belief, that I believe what I say, or if I say, ouch, you may presume that I'm actually in pain, and not necessarily that I'm just faking it. I might be, but you don't need any evidence to presume that the state I'm expressing or voicing is the state I'm in. That's an ordinary, common presumption that we reasonably make in interpersonal communication. Why do we make it? At least two reasons, and Kant did talk about this. One is that sociality is impossible if we have to second guess or revisit or doubt whether people are in the states that their utterances conventionally voice. If I say ouch, and you say, okay, well, ouch, 70% of people when they say ouch are in pain, but 30% are not necessarily. Let me quickly go, he's probably in pain, but I'm going to hold that open. Can't do that. Or if I say, there's a fire, you've got to go down the hall. Or if I say help, and the person says, well, probably when he says help, he's crying for help, but he might be acting out a part, might be playing a prank. we can't have real communication if we're second-guessing whether the utterance expresses the state that it conventionally voices, whether the utterance is actually voicing the state that it conventionally expresses, whether people are in the state that these utterances voice. So that's one reason. The other reason is it's a perfectly appropriate epistemic burden shifting. Right? We can't check what's inside people's minds. We can check a lot of things that people have superior access to. So we shift the burden. On the question of whether you believe what you're saying or you feel what you're expressing, I defer to you. Right? I presume that what you're saying is true. If I have reason for doubt, I don't have to stick with that presumption, but I'm licensed not to check the matter, not to question the matter. And I want to say those same reasons apply to the state ostensibly voiced by a word giving, which is knowledge. Right? The same reasons apply. If I give you my word, I'm voicing knowledge. Right? I'm expressing, I may not actually know, but what I'm expressing is a speech act that is only felicitous when I know what I say. If I say, I guarantee you such is the case, conventionally that is an expression of knowledge. And for the same reasons I just mentioned, you're licensed to presume I'm in the state that I express. You're licensed to presume, right? To say, well, he's giving you his word, but not all word giving, word givings aren't necessarily true. He's overconfident. You don't have to do that. You might do that. You have every reason to do it if you want to, if you're a cautious or suspicious person, but you have a reasonable presumption in place, which is the presumption that people are in the state that their utterances voice. And that applies for all the same reasons to word giving and to guarantees and to promising that, right? Which is we can't have, there's a reason to have these speech acts. Just as I can't always know what's in your heart or head, so I defer to you on whether you believe or feel what you say, I can't always know the facts that you have superior access to. I can't always know whether the building is empty. And I have to know. I have to close off the matter for scrutiny. We have to demolish the building at some point. I can't always know whether a product is safe that I didn't manufacture. So I have to defer to you. So it's reasonable for me to defer to you. And the final step in the argument is that if this presumption is in place, I incur, as with ordinary speech, a special strict liability. Why? Because in knowingly giving you a reason to presume that I'm speaking accurately, I am knowingly causing you to let your epistemic guard down, to diminish your epistemic protection. I'm knowingly reducing your protection against falsehood. If you're with me that epistemic harms are harms, not everyone believes that. I think believing a falsehood is bad. I'm going on a limb. Believing a falsehood is bad. Suffering epistemic harm is bad. Acting on it is worse. Changing your perspective on things in light of it is worse. But an epistemic harm is a harm. And if I knowingly reduce your protection against the harm, I incur a corresponding vulnerability of my own to accountability. This symmetry I'm claiming as a premise, right? So I'm not going to argue for it. I'm simply hoping that, similar to the kind of liability lottery that Waldron and David Lewis talk about, if I impose a risk on you, I incur a risk of liability. If I single-handedly impose a risk on you, not if I merely increase the chances. If we increase the chances together, I inform you, I tell you I think something, you take it as evidence and you believe me, you're participating in that increased risk. But if I impose a risk on you, if I if I forcibly remove your jacket and it's freezing outside, I'm responsible if you catch a cold as a result. I'm responsible for the fact that you feel cold. If I tell you, you don't need your jacket, it's cold, it's warm, and you go out, I'm causing you to feel increased vulnerability, but I'm not single-handedly imposing that vulnerability on you. And I'm saying, as with the standard view of liability with risk, if I impose a decreased protection on you by saying something that you may reasonably presume without checking, by guaranteeing something that you may reasonably presume is true and close off further scrutiny, I incur a corresponding responsibility for the truth of what I guarantee. I'm responsible for the harm to which I expose you. And I do expose you, because when I guarantee you something is the case, you may reasonably presume it. You have specially lowered protection, unlike with persuasive assurances, unlike with ordinary assertions. And so, similarly, I incur a corresponding vulnerability to being held liable. That's the basic view. And it applies similarly to cases of guarantees, promising that something is the case, and to commercial speech, where again it is assertion presented as known and not merely an opinion, and seeking deference. And in these cases, because I knowingly impose vulnerability on you, vulnerability to the harm of false belief, I am responsible if that harm materializes. Therefore, what we thought made sense, I think, does make sense. We are morally responsible, strictly liable for word giving that's intelligible, that makes sense, and that accounts for the legal and the moral practice. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Are there any questions or comments from Will? I have Will in first place, and then Brian as the starter. Yeah.
This is for the paper.
Thanks.
This isn't so much. It's not a criticism or anything. It's just when I was thinking through your analysis in terms of deference, and so I kept thinking this is like the Razian account of authority, right? I mean, what you're doing when you give your word is you are putting yourself forward as an authority on this matter and inviting that person to treat you that way. And so, in other words, to treat your assertion as an exclusionary reason, that, that's different from trying to persuade them and so on, giving them reasons. So I'm wondering whether you could make use of that Razian machinery to explain your intuition about what's distinctive about word giving.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. I think absolutely, and I appreciate that. I think it is very much an authority-based account. I have to think more about that. I feel as though a Razian exclusionary reason, it's certainly in the ballpark of banishing of the deference I'm talking about, but it might be a little weaker, or it might be part of the picture. So even if I vouch that something, let's say I put my reputation on the line that this.
Yeah, that's another point I want to bring up.
Or I'm an expert. I'm a medical expert, and I say such and such is the case. And I have conclusive reasons of my own to believe it, and those reasons are epistemically transparent to you. You may have reasons to not consider at the moment alternatives, or to not doubt it at the moment. But they may be of the kind that simply settle an evidentiary debate. So there may be evidences that serve as exclusionary reasons. There may be evidentiary exclusionary reasons, such that the evidentiary question is, this is such strong evidence that you are epistemically reasonable if you just stop investigating. But it's a little bit, it might be weaker, I'm not sure, it might be weaker than an invitation to consider the matter consider it impossible for the matter to be inaccurate, and therefore to assume I'm actually sharing a fact that cannot turn out to be false. It might be even stronger than just the Razian style exclusionary reason, where I can take this as the decisive winning argument or winning factor. Because I do want to distinguish word giving from expert testimony. I want to distinguish it now. In an earlier version I didn't, and I wrote, no, it's not going to. An expert testimony, I think, might also supply Razian exclusionary reasons. I'm not sure, and I have to think more about that.
Yeah, and one break.
Sure.
It seems to be something special about giving your word. It's different from giving a guarantee or promising and so on. So it has something to do. I mean, maybe this is an old notion, but when people gave their word, their honor was at stake, right? And so you're giving a kind of assurance there, or you are raising the stakes. In other words, you are leaving yourself vulnerable to. You really do have to be right here because your honor's at stake. It isn't just, I really think I got this right, and you can take my word on that. I mean, it's I am a bad person if it turns out that I'm wrong. So I see word giving as different from those other cases.
Yeah,
like I say, that might be just an old-fashioned notion.
It would be a 5-minute search and replace operation for me to fix this in light of that, but it might be pretty dramatic. So Yeah, word giving does have that connotation. When I presented this in front of a philosopher of language, David Kaplan, he said, well, what about on my word? It's not a guarantee. You might say, strike me down if this has any sugar in it. Strike me down, or, I'm an idiot, unless I'm a total idiot. Or even, I put my entire reputation of 30 years on this.
That's the one.
And that's what Hume, in his discussion of conventions and promises, tried to distinguish. He tried to say the best sense we can make of promises is that somebody puts their honor on something, and stakes their honor on something. And I think that that's right, but I appreciate that you're probably only, so far, one of the few people who's heard me argue this, that have said that that's different from what I mean by guaranteeing. It is, I think it is different. And so I like the fact that you think that as well. A guarantee, word giving, as I'm describing, it may actually be referring to guarantees, which are distinct. The difference is when I say I stake my reputation, that is a form of emphasis and a form of increasing the weight and the strength of the reasons I give you to believe it.
Yeah.
You think, he wouldn't do that unless it's true. Or now I'm licensed to really, really criticize him if he's wrong. Whereas if I guarantee it, I'm seeking a different kind of epistemic, again, deference, epistemic state on your part, where you're not just kind of, now you can hold me to it in a very strong way. I'm actually seeking your presumption that it's true, which is, again, a different. So I appreciate that, and you may be right, but that will require some word processing exercise. So
I'm sure you're fully capable.
So I want to start in sort of a similar place, the Rawlsian analysis. And Rawls, of course, was originally responding to Wolff's argument. And Wolff says, why should anyone ever give over decision-making to someone else? And Rawls's analysis basically is there will be circumstances where you judge that you're more likely to get it right by deferring than by deciding for yourself. And here, you give the example, look, if I take your umbrella and it's raining, boy, am I responsible. But you're not taking anyone's umbrella, right? You're saying, it's on my word, or I guarantee, or whatever, that he's innocent, or that's not the sort of thing he would do, or she was someplace else, or whatever. It's not clear why the person you're addressing should, at that point, surrender. The Wolffian notion that everyone has a moral responsibility to decide for themselves. Now, we can then move back to the examples you're trying to distinguish. Well, here are my reasons. Here are my degrees that show my expertise and what I ground my expert judgment on. But you're saying this is something different. That I'm telling you to just give it all up to me because I really mean it. Not because I have any reasons to give you or because I'm grounding in my expertise, but because I tell you to. To which I think the Wolffian response is they have the option, and the moral option is don't surrender. Right? So true, if you cause them to surrender their judgment, strict liability makes sense, but the appropriate response is they shouldn't be surrendering their judgment.
Right, so if I can even sharpen that challenging question. Great. It is, in fact, the Wolffian directive would be don't surrender. And if you should not surrender, then correspondingly, I'm not on the hook for inducing you to surrender, and therefore my argument for why I'm strictly liable falls apart. I'm not strictly liable, right? I wouldn't be, because you shouldn't surrender. And if you shouldn't surrender, you're not licensed to surrender. If you're not licensed to surrender, no argument for why I'm not increasing your on this challenge. I'm not increasing your vulnerability after all. So I think that's absolutely so. I think that, is this Robert Paul Wolff? Yeah. So so this is a kind of, for those who don't know, it's a familiar virtue type argument that people must decide for themselves certain things. And two things. So first of all, even in the expert authority case that you've first described, where Raz, great man, but no epistemologist. But it does say,
Put that on the gravestone.
I would take it as a compliment. So So even where Roz would say in the expert, look, you should decide for yourself. Wolf is right, but we can't decide. We can't check everything for ourselves. So one of the things you might decide for yourself is that so and so is an expert, and so I'm going to listen to them. But that's also, and this is very helpful to what I'm trying to say. That's also in the category of evidence-based reasons to believe, right? You ought to believe me because I'm a doctor. You don't go to medical school to double check. You don't have time. But here I'm not substituting your judgment. I'm not banishing your judgment. I'm inviting it. I'm giving you a reason, an evidence reason, my expertise being that evidence, to believe it. Now there are reasons, as you correctly note, I distinguish word giving. Word giving, I'm claiming, is not evidence-based. I'm not giving you a reason because I know best in this particular instance. The larger practice of the presumption might be justified by more global versions of that reasoning. But in the particular case where I give you my word, I say, you're running to your fireman. You're about to to empty a building, and you see me running out of the building. You say, is anyone else upstairs? And I say, no, I really need to know because I got to switch my efforts to another building. I say, I guarantee you, no one's upstairs. I'm not a building expert. I'm some schmo running out of a building. I'm not a construction and demolition fire expert, but I make the extra step of guaranteeing.
But you could just say, look, I was just up there and I didn't see anyone.
That would be the case. That would be an example of expert authority or invoking my expertise. Then it would be evidence-based. If I guarantee it and give you my word, it'd be a word giving. At the very least, these are different kinds of, at least I'm describing it. It may be that my argument for why the latter should be treated differently has no basis. But they're different kinds of things. They're presumptions. And the reason I would resist, where I get off the boat from the Wolf argument, and this is really a critique, not of you, but of Wolf, is that there's an obvious and ever-present counterexample, which is every time we believe that somebody is speaking sincerely, every time we presume, which is what we do, every time we presume that somebody is expressing themselves authentically, right? It is common practice to presume, not to doubt, that an utterance actually expresses the state it ostensibly expresses. These kind of presumptions, they're not part of our reasons for being persuaded by someone else. They form the bedrock of the very practice of interpersonal communication. Once it's in place, we then have reason to take a particular declaration as authoritative, expert, grounded, justified, and so forth. And then you have the standard questions of transmission of knowledge. But in order for us to have interpersonal communication of a meaningful kind, we make these presumptions, which I think are practical rather than epistemic, that somebody is in the state their utterance conventionally voices. And Wolf may be right as a matter of you should decide matters for yourself, but a lot of these matters we don't decide for themselves, we can't decide for themselves, and we're not epistemically vicious, I think, for failing to do so. And all I want to do is extend that to the case of word givings, and at least propose that the reasons this special kind of presumption in ordinary speech and communication is justified apply to word givings. Again, it's just a presumption. I'm not saying that if I guarantee you, and you're the fireman, you don't have, that you are required or even guided in any way to take my word. I'm just saying that there is a reasonable presumption that you may use, and just because of the fact that you may reasonably use it without being epistemically vicious, I have at least risked or made you vulnerable, because you may use, I've exposed you to vulnerability. Doesn't mean you have to take my word. It doesn't mean you're even reasonable. It means you're reasonable to do so, but you might be even more reasonable not to do so, and that's fine. It's a special kind of presumption, different from acceptance, different from belief, different from agreement, and different from being persuaded on the basis of the evidence. And yes, it runs afoul of Wolf's directive, which I just have to bite that bullet. I don't know if that...
Thomas.
Thank you. It was a fascinating paper. I would not have any criticism on it, but I would have some questions whether you can expand the arguments to other cases. Okay, so the first question has to do with presumption. I think that perhaps we can distinguish a few different kinds of presumptions. when for instance, the example of a person upstairs, I'm going to demolish this building, and I say, I guarantee you there's no person upstairs. You still have to check it before you demolish the building. But and you have a way to do it. You can climb up the stairs and check it. It's no effort. But there was a case in the UK. Neil McCormick comments on the book, on his book, Legal Reason and Legal Theory. It's about a school teacher who goes to a chemical, buy some chemical to make an experiment in the class, and she mixes up the things, and there's an explosion in the classroom, and a child is injured. And they say, no, the school teacher is not liable because there was a saying in the package of the product that this is so and so, and she relied on it. She was not liable. The producer was liable, but there's a difference between you can't check. You cannot look through the box to see whether or not there's caffeine in the coffee that you're buying in the supermarket. So I wonder if you can if there's a need to specify perhaps these different types of presumption, perhaps a rebuttable and a non-rebuttable presumption. And I would have another case. So this is the first question, okay? The second has to do with the kind of fact that we're talking about. You only gave examples of empirical facts. What if I'm talking about a normative fact? What if a father says to a son, this is the morally right thing to do? So, and if he accepts it as a presumption, would that be a kind of a strict liability, perhaps, or not, depending on how it is phrased, on how it is affirmed, or perhaps to make it a worst case scenario, like a very religious person, a very committed person, and the priest or the religious authority say, no, this would be a sin, and you believe it would be a sin, and then it turns out it is not. Would that make a difference? Would that be expandable to these cases or not? Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, so to start with, rebuttable versus non-rebuttable presumptions. These are great to be with lawyers in a room because these terms just roll off the tongue around here, whereas they don't. Default logic, you won't hear the same kind of talk. Defeasible, they might say, but I mean a rebuttable presumption. So I don't mean a presumption that I don't mean that the presumption is permanent. So you're licensed to presume it, which is the act, if I can call it that, of not checking and not examining and not reassessing. But suppose some reason for doubt emerges. So suppose I give you the person, I guarantee you no one's in the building. And then I turn around, the fireman turns around and sees him walking over. Watch this, right? Laughing and this. If you continue to presume it, you would be, very, very foolish. Or if I see, if I see my talking to my co-conspirators, okay, we've got him trapped up there. They think he's not there, or something vile like that, or any other reason that doubt may emerge. I'm arguing, or at least I'm trying to be consistent with the view that you should revisit and you should actually drop the presumption. And that's perfectly the problem is that often enough, when I give you my word, for the very same reasons I'm in a superior capacity, you won't have a chance you won't encounter other evidence. And if you do make the presumption, you might not be on the lookout for further evidence, which I'm also saying is justified. So it's a rebuttable presumption, but you're still at risk. I'm still imposing on you in the taking of the umbrella sense. I'm imposing on you because this presumption is out there, metaphysically, so in social space, for you to reasonably avail yourself of, regardless of this particular instance, regardless of who I am, and therefore you may reasonably and automatically and unconsciously even avail yourself of it, and be in a state of epistemic risk. And nothing may give you reason to doubt. Nothing may rebut the presumption. Clearly in a case, but I agree, in cases like where there's reasons to reconsider, you might be wise not to avail yourself of this ordinary presumption, as with, again, with ordinary speech, right? When I tell you the building is empty, I don't say guarantee you, I just say the building's empty, or I assert it's not raining, or I assert this is the shorter way, the shorter route, or in those cases, you may in some instances think, yeah, but this person's a liar, or this person's overconfident, or any number of other, or they have a motive to lie. You may have any number of reasons even there not to avail yourself of the presumption of sincerity that I'm claiming is reasonable, if you did. So it's a weak thing. It's enough to generate the responsibility because it imposes a potential risk, but it's not, so it's rebuttable. It's very different from cases. I remember I heard of a case where they used to lie in computer stores about the memory and the chip. Are you going to personally count the megabytes? You going to open up the...
I do.
I mean, so the computer says 64, or the packaging, I don't know what it is, 10 megabytes, in the flash drive, and it's 2. Of course I have to presume, and that's much harder to rebut. So I agree with you that they're different, but they're all rebuttable in the sense of in terms of normative facts, so you actually lumped religious and normative claims. I think if the father says, trust me, lying is a sin, especially to your father, lying is a sin. I said, are you sure it's a sin? Because I remember in Sunday school, no, I guarantee you it's a sin. That strikes me as an empirical, a kind of empirical claim. Because maybe I'm talking about what's in the Quran, what's in the Bible, what's in the, right? What it would be recognized by the relevant evidence. If I tell you lying, he said, is it always wrong to lie? And I say, yes. No, but what if you really don't want to hurt someone's feelings? No, it's absolutely wrong to lie. I guarantee you. Are you sure, Daddy? Well, listen, I happen to be a moral philosopher. And I've ruled it out. I guarantee you. Now there, although I disputed Wolff, I think this is the case that Brian's example of Wolff really had in mind, which is these kinds of moral decisions that reflect your moral autonomy as a person. I think there you can respond. In moral facts, there's 2 reasons. One is, it's a good question. I think there the presumption is not as reasonable. Because you might be thought that for moral matters you are supposed to make up your own mind. That would be the Wolff answer. And actually there is a paper on peer disagreement about moral matters. I think it's Pryor, a paper which in fact invokes the Wolff answer, says you can't defer to epistemic peers on moral matters because there are no moral... on moral matters, you have to decide for yourself. It's a fundamental part of agency. So that's one quick answer that I got the idea from Brian, but I'm actually stalling, so I have to think more about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Sandra, and then...
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering have you considered a distinction between the case of the friend who is defending her friend for an accusation and the other example of the physician? Because it seems to me that it is not the same kind of moral responsibility. In the first case, the friend who is based his decision in reasons, and the case of an authority like the physician who is an expert, I think there is a difference between the both cases, and it feels that it shouldn't be the same level of responsibility, of moral responsibility. So that's a question. Thank you.
Good, yeah. So if I could rewrite the paper just in this one sentence, would you say, if I can ask you, would you say the same? Suppose the friend wasn't what we call an alibi witness. So the friend says he didn't do the crime. I know him, and was playing poker with him for the entire time during this activity. Would you then say that it's different from the physician? In the sense that you mean? Well, the friend is the evidence. I'm saying I'm his alibi. I was with him the whole time, and he couldn't have done it, even with me. Is that similar in your sense to the authority of the physician?
Well, I I know my friend, and I have reasons to believe that he's.
So yeah, because if I say I know my friend because he's a nice guy, I think that I agree with you. That's much weaker, as an epistemic expertise sort of authority than the case of an alibi witness, where I was with him and I'm claiming to be his alibi or her alibi. In that case, I think I do have. In the alibi case, I feel I'm as much an expert on this person's whereabouts as a physician is an expert on the chemical dispositions of certain drugs. I'm not sure the same applies to just being someone's friend for many years. But what I think this calls attention to is something important, which I should have said, which is, so I appreciate it, which is, I'm claiming that you are strictly morally accountable for word giving. The word giving is one of the things that if you express them and you're inaccurate, you're answerable. But I wonder if it's the only such thing. So there might be cases of what I'm calling assurances or assertions that for separate moral reasons or epistemic reasons end up in the same moral territory of strictly accountable. And one of those possible cases might be where there is an extreme vulnerability of a different kind between the speaker and the audience. And in fact, or if in fact invitations to rely might in certain instances generate a similar kind of moral accountability. I've talked about why word giving generates the accountability it does, but I haven't talked about why other things might as well. And one of them, you might think, a physician is in a superior or a very lopsided relation of knowledge and expertise and power vis-a-vis the patient, that they may incur a similar kind of responsibility that I'm talking about, even if it's for different moral reasons. Doesn't necessarily involve the presumption. It might be reasons for belief that are so powerful and so vulnerability-inducing that it might be similar. And in that sense, the physician might also be different from the friend. But I think if you massage the friend case, you can get them into similar epistemic expertise type of claims and expertise type of grounds to be true, to be right. But you may be pointing to another kind of reason why a physician or an official authority, as opposed to a merely evidentiary authority like the alibi witness, might have more responsibility. And I don't know. There's something to think about it.
Noel?
So it might be the case that a lot of people who engage in the practice of word giving are in these Gettier type situations where they have true justified belief. So it is true, and maybe on their own account they are, it makes sense for them to give their word, but they actually do not have knowledge, right? So it's not something that they can maybe give their word on. Do you think that these people would be morally liable, maybe not legally liable, but morally liable for giving their word in cases in which they might not have knowledge, depending on your account of the Gettier paradox? Yeah.
Right. Excellent. So this campus is a movie set just outside the School of Drama. I know that this being UNAM, the School of Drama is probably 10 miles away, but 10 kilometers away. But let's assume that the drama's right there, and there's a movie set, and the rain is coming down. But as a matter of fact, it's also raining beyond the movie set. So I say to you, it's raining. Now look at the way it's raining. And then the window's closed, and you can't check. Sorry, but it's a hackneyed example. It's raining. And you say, no, it's not. You just think it because it was raining on the way over. No, I guarantee you, I give you my word, it's raining. And that would be a classic Gettier type case where it's true. I'm justified in thinking it's true, but I clearly don't know. So, yeah, it's a great case. My answer is less exciting than the question, which is, there are a lot of cases where I give you my word, and it's infelicitous. I'm not in the state of knowledge that I'm expressing, but there's no harm whatsoever. I've made you not quite so vulnerable because, in point of fact, it's true. If you find out later, I mean, let's give a more dramatic example. I give you my word, the building is empty because I looked through the window and didn't see anybody. But the building is in fact empty. I looked from outside and nobody's there. But the building is in fact empty, so it's true. It's justified. Well, let's say I looked through all the windows, so it's justified. So let's make it just assume it meets get here, but it's false. Sorry, but I don't know. I don't have knowledge. Whatever anyone's view of knowledge might be. And then you demolish the building, nothing, and then you find out that I based it on the fact that I looked through the windows. I think you'd have a pretty reasonable complaint against me, saying, look, luckily the building was destroyed, nobody was hurt, but you gave me your word, you guaranteed it on the basis of looking in the gosh darn windows? That's it? I think that'd be a reasonable grievance, a reasonable complaint. It wouldn't be nearly as serious as if I actually harmed anybody because of it, but I mean, if I said, I guarantee you it's empty, and I'm basing this on I know. You said, how do you know? Well, because I looked through the windows. No, then you don't know. And your guarantee is not quite a guarantee. It's a report of of what you claim to be a very strong belief based on evidence. So I think, yeah, I would have to say it's not a word giving. It is therefore inauthentic, but these things become less weighty, the less harmful or risky or vulnerability that they actually bring about. If that helps.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you very much, Jeffrey, for this interesting paper and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Si tienen alguna pregunta en español y trato de en algún momento llevar a cabo una traducción para las preguntas de ellos, si se sienten más a gusto y con más confianza planteando la pregunta en español, yo intentaré llevar a cabo la traducción. Entonces, anímense si es el caso. Sí. Continuamos con el profesor Brian Biggs y después también lo vamos a abrir a discusión y yo creo que ahí también pueden comentarle alguna cuestión al profesor Jeff, pero continuamos con la ponencia del profesor Brian Biggs. Él es licenciado en Derecho por la Universidad de Harvard, tiene un doctorado en Filosofía por la Universidad de Oxford y actualmente es profesor de la Universidad de Minnesota. El profesor Brian Biggs es un amigo del instituto, tiene publicaciones importantes aquí en el instituto, llevadas a cabo por miembros del personal académico como Enrique Rodríguez Trujano, el diccionario y el libro de Filosofía del Derecho, ubicación de los problemas en su contexto. Así que démosle la bienvenida al profesor Brian Biggs. Thank you very much, Brian, for accepting this invitation. It's an honor to have you here in Mexico again.
So this whole event is, to a large extent, a thank you, necessarily an inadequate thank you, but a thank you for all that you and your colleagues have done for legal philosophy in general, for communication across scholars, your work on the journal. It's a great contribution to legal philosophy, and we're here to honor that, and thank you for all you've done and will continue to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Here, here. Now for the less important part. I apologize. I have almost no Spanish, and I'm sorry you have to listen in English. I'll try to read it and read it slowly so it can be understood. Though if you have trouble understanding, the people who've read it in English say they can't understand it either, so do what we can. There's a well-established literature about whether, when, or to what extent citizens have a moral obligation to obey the law. That discussion looks at various possible justifications for a prima facie moral obligation. The proffered justifications range across arguments based on consequences, consent, gratitude, and fair play reciprocity, and the role of government in distributing benefits and burdens across society. For a long time, the consensus was that citizens do have such a moral obligation, at least for generally just legal regimes. In recent years, scholars have raised questions about that consensus, and many now argue that there is no such general moral obligation to obey, and that moral analysis needs to be on a more individualized basis, considering the moral obligation of certain citizens to obey particular laws. The literature regarding the moral obligation to obey or to comply with particular categories of obligations is significantly less well developed. There is some discussion in connection with criminal law, much of it by critical race theorists, but there appears to be little in connection with private law. With criminal law, the connection with general debates about the moral obligation to obey seem more straightforward. When the law commands us to do or not do something, do we have a moral obligation to obey or comply with those commands? With private law, the analysis will inevitably be different, as legal rules here are not best understood as commands. While legal rules in this area are certainly intended to affect behavior, they are generally not direct commands to do or not do things, so the analysis of our moral obligation will inevitably look different. In this paper, I will examine whether and when there is a moral obligation to perform one's contractual obligations. The first part offers a brief overview of the debate about the moral obligation to obey the law, and then turn to the connection between contract theory and a moral obligation to perform contracts. Part 3 turns to the role of absent or imperfect contractual consent in the evaluation of one's moral obligation. Part 4 looks at the connection between corrective justice and its analogs and distributive justice. And Part 5 looks at what is meant by keeping one's contracts before concluding. There's a large and long-standing literature going back at least to Plato's dialogue The Crito and Sophocles' play Antigone regarding whether and when there is a moral obligation to obey the law. There's obviously not space here to do justice to that extensive discussion, but it'd be useful to present the question to offer a brief, it'd be useful to the present question to offer a brief overview. First, even those who argue that there is a moral obligation to obey the law generally hold that this is only true for generally just legal systems, and that the moral obligation is presumptive and thus defeasible. Second, even those who deny that there is a general moral obligation to obey will concede that there are often moral obligations to act consistently with what the law prescribes, because legal prescriptions often track moral prescriptions. However, the argument would go, the reason one should not murder, rob, or kidnap is due to the moral and also prudential reasons that would apply whether those actions were illegal or not. Those who argue for a moral obligation to obey often focus on actions, choices, or inactions which they argue constitute consent to obey the law. The attention is generally on voting, accepting state benefits, or refusing to move out of the jurisdiction. The claim is that by casting a ballot, one has implicitly affirmed the law that results from the elected government, or that not leaving the country is a way of showing that one approves of the community's rules. Those who deny a moral obligation cast doubt on whether so much moral weight can be placed on these ambiguous actions, and whether even if those actions do entail moral duties, whether these can extend to even relatively trivial laws or circumstances where disobedience will neither harm others nor undermine a generally just legal system. There's a related argument based on gratitude. The gratitude argument is roughly that citizens owe obedience to the state, at least generally just state, in return for all the benefits received: fire protection, police protection, national security, public education, and so on. Critics question the extent to which gratitude is appropriate if benefits are not asked for, or if the giver benefits also from the actions. Additionally, critics wonder if the giver of a benefit has any right to set the terms of gratitude, or whether obedience to all laws is more than the state has reason to expect by way of gratitude for the actions. One sometimes hears consequentialist arguments for the obligation to obey the law. The best-known example is that of Thomas Hobbes, who argued for an obligation to obey on the basis that the alternative to obedience was chaos, the state of nature, the war of all against all. A somewhat different argument sometimes offered for the obligation to obey the law is based on fair play. This argument is different, not least in the way that the purported duties owed to fellow citizens, not to the state. The idea is that society is a joint project. in which all make sacrifice and gain benefits, and for individuals to take benefits without making their share of sacrifices is a wrong done to the other members of the joint project. A skeptic might suggest that if a particular illegal action does not undermine society, perhaps it's morally trivial and was not seen by impressionable observers, and does not directly harm any other individuals, it's unclear on what ground one's fellow citizens could justly complain. To the view that one has at most a legal obligation to obey or at least comply with some legal rules, but not all of them, supporters of a general moral obligation argue that legal systems are seamless webs, that burdens and benefits are distributed across persons and across topics. Additionally, the argument goes, a theory that encourages citizens to pick and choose when they think they have a moral obligation to obey invites inevitably error-prone and self-serving choices. What if one concludes that there is an obligation to obey the law? Would it then follow that one has an obligation to keep contracts? As already noted, the structure of analysis appears to be different. Most obviously, obeying laws already seems different from keeping contracts. Our legal system, at least the legal systems with which I'm familiar, do not require people to perform contracts the way they require them not to steal or to pay a certain percentage of their income to the government. As will be discussed below, the law's message on contracts is more along the lines of either perform or pay damages. Generally speaking, one is not jailed or even fined for failing to perform one's contracts. In American contract law, damages are meant to be compensatory, not punitive. And the obligation to pay compensation generally does not require the existence of fault, nor does it vary with levels of fault. As will be seen, the relationship between one's view on the general moral obligation to obey the law and one's view on the moral obligation to keep one's contracts is necessarily complicated. As one moves the subject from the whole legal system and every legal rule promulgated to the smaller focus on agreements, considerations change, not least in the starting assumption that one has consented to each of one's contractual agreements in a way that one has not to each of the legal system's rules. More on this below. Contract law theory and theories of other doctrinal areas of law are meant to explain the law, to show its essence. Thus, different contract law theories present a different picture of what is going on in the practice of making contracts and the practice of enforcing them. It then seems reasonable to ask whether one's choice of the correct or the best theory of contract law might have implications for the analysis regarding the moral obligation to keep contracts. For example, if contracts are essentially promises, it would seem reasonable to note that the presumptive immorality of breaking one's promise. Or if contracts are essentially about the creation of reasonable reliance in other parties, it might be reasonable to note the presumptive immorality of acting contrary to such reasonable reliance. On the other hand, if contract rules are just about maximizing wealth or preference satisfaction, the immoral force of not performing as contractually obligated is less clear, or at least less powerful. Although this last point may be too quick, one could easily imagine a rule utilitarian approach under which legal rules in general and particular contract doctrines are chosen or should be chosen on the basis that these are the principles which, if followed, will generally maximize collective utility. All this assumes, of course, that rule utilitarianism is the best approach for matters of policy or morality, and that, of course, is highly contested. And there is an obvious twist to consider, that the best approach for lawmakers in constructing a legal system and promulgating legal rules may not necessarily be the best approach for individuals responding to legal rules. Even within the rubric of rule utilitarianism, and even assuming that lawmakers have promulgated the rules and doctrine which will work best to maximize utility, it does not follow that a rule utilitarian citizen should adopt the rules, do as the law prescribe, or the rule, keep one's valid contracts. In thinking about how contract law, qua promise or qua consent, may bind us, it might be instructive to recall David Hume's well-known critique of social contract theories of government. One part of Hume's critique was that the legitimacy of government cannot be based on the consent of the governed, or on the promises of the governed, because allegiance to government and fidelity to promises are grounded in the same way. And if one is problematic, then so is the other. Hume considers three possible grounds for moral obligation: the moral obligation to do what one has consented to, the moral obligation to do what one has promised to do, and the moral obligation of allegiance to government and law. Hume argues that all three are justified if they are justified by social utility. Of course, the point of this is not that Hume is necessarily correct on these judgments. It may be that one cannot take a view, the point is that one may not take a view on the relatively small question of an obligation to keep one's contracts without probably having to take a position on more foundational questions on what grounds moral foundations generally. Returning to the inquiry about the connection between contract theory and one's obligation to keep contracts, it should be added that if one is skeptical about contract theory generally, or if one believes that contract theory express a plurality of values, then contract theory will offer little or no guidance on the moral obligation question. The connection between consent and contract law is complicated. On one hand, the idea or the ideal of freedom of contract, that one has only those contractual duties one has chosen, is central to modern contract law thinking. On the other hand, we are all aware that the level of consent in a large percentage of contracts is far from optimal. If one views full or perfect consent as a combination of full information, reasonable alternatives, and no coercion, it's easy to see that most contracting, especially by those with less powers, most consumers, employees, and tenants, falls far short. In contracts today, one or both parties may lack full information, one or both parties may lack reasonable alternatives, for example, because of economic necessity or because all vendors provide the same terms. For the most extreme failures of consent, American contract law allows a doctrinal response. Agreements that are the products of certain forms of duress or fraud or mistake can be rescinded. However, these are only the most extreme cases, and in many types of less than optimal consent will evoke no doctrinal defense to enforcement. There are, to be sure, a small number of doctrinal questions for which lesser showings of defective consent might still be relative, but again, these are few and of less significance. At what point does defective consent defeat any obligation one might have, any moral obligation one might have to perform? Consider one parameter along which consent is generally defective. In many of our agreements, we do not have reasonable alternatives. In a sense, we have no choice but to accept certain terms. I may need a job desperately to support my family, to pay the rent, and to obtain adequate health insurance. But all available jobs in my community for my skill level pay the same wages and contain the same mandatory arbitration provision. On a different example, having a cell phone may be a near necessity for my work and for everyday life, but the contracts for all the cell phone providers may contain the same limitation of liability and limitation of warranty provisions. Yet even where there is no real choice about certain provisions, and even where there are good arguments that the terms are unfair while falling short of shocking the conscience or being egregiously unfair, one might hesitate to say that this is sufficient to undermine a moral obligation to perform one's contracts. After all, if consent is significantly below the optimal or enough to remove the moral obligation to perform, this might mean that there is no such obligation for the vast majority of agreements we enter as consumers. Is this not then a reductio ad absurdum of the line of analysis? Well, not necessarily. Again, to borrow the analogy with whether there is a moral obligation to obey the law, a number of theorists who doubt that there is a general presumptive moral obligation argue that this conclusion, even if true, would not lead to anarchy, even if believed by most people. The argument is that most people still follow most of the law, or at least the most important laws, most of the time, in part because the law tends to track pre-existing moral obligations, and in part because we have prudential reasons to avoid legal sanctions or the reputation of being a lawbreaker. Similarly, people will keep their contracts most of the time, just as they will obey the law most of the time, even if they do not think they have a general moral obligation to do so. There may be individual contracts one believes one has a moral obligation to keep. Additionally, one might have ample prudential reasons for performing, one not wanting to be sued, and wanting to have the reputation as someone who performs one's contracts, and so on. A more substantive response would be the mere lack of reasonable alternatives without more is not sufficient to remove or reduce one's moral obligations. If terms are reasonable, the fact that one had little choice in accepting them may not be morally problematic, even if it is far from ideal. What arguably raises more serious moral problems are when certain types of provisions and standard forms, which are buried deep in contracts, language almost impossible for non-lawyers to understand, terms not brought to the attention of the other party, and where they are also substantively one-sided and unreasonable. Carl Llewellyn, discussing standard forms 60 years ago, argued that parties consented expressly to the main negotiated terms and offered blanket assent to all not unreasonable terms hidden in the fine print. But what if the terms are not unreasonable? What if they are, in fact, unreasonable? There would be significant argument that one has not really consented to such terms, that one would in any event not have a moral obligation to comply with them. Two brief matters worth noting. First, and most obviously, good faith observers can differ as to what counts as a reasonable or unreasonable term. One prominent example, many people use a sort of cross-collateral provision in sales made by Walker Thomas Furniture in a well-known case as a paradigm of an unconscionable term, while Professor Richard Epstein offered a strong argument that such provisions were in fact entirely reasonable given the commercial circumstances of the case. Of course, we should not be surprised by the existence of controversy surrounding moral judgments. Secondly, there is a question of whether sufficiently expressed consent will alter the evaluation. What if a conceitedly unreasonable term had been brought to your attention, the meaning of the term was explained to you, and you initialed or signed the term? Would that express consent always, sometimes, never be enough to create a moral obligation to comply with the term? This part is, after all, about the significance of consent, how its absence or defects in it might alter our moral obligation. But it's worth asking the inverse question. To what extent does consent, even in its relatively express or full form, overcome moral objections that might be rather strong? A number of theorists have constructed theories of tort law that center on corrective justice. It is less common to see theories of contract law foreground corrective justice, but there's no question that corrective justice or something like it is a central element of contract law. Breach of contract is essentially an argument by one party to a contract that he or she has been harmed by the other party and that the court should order some remedial action that will correct the harm or at least lessen it. Even if one rejects a corrective justice view of contract law, it remains the case that contracts involve promises of performance, and contract law promises orders to pay compensatory damages if parties fail to do whatever they have promised. I want to focus on the obligation, whether to perform or to pay, and consider them in relation to other duties and other actual potential harms. One question has arisen in connection with tort law and has relevance for contract law as well, is how we should treat the relationship between distributive justice and corrective justice. Distributive justice, of course, is the justice of the distribution of benefits and burdens in society. By many accounts, ours is a society of significant distributive injustice. This is not the place to debate the merits of this conclusion, but let's accept it as true for the purpose of the discussion. Would that injustice ever affect claims under corrective justice? Specifically, would the obligation to compensate be effective if people who have far less than they should, due to unjust discrimination, oppression, lack of opportunity, and so on, cause damage through a negligent or intentional action against people who have far more than they should for comparably unjust or unjustifiable reasons? Or when oppressed breach a contract with their oppressors? In the abstract, considerations of corrective justice seem to be independent of considerations of distributive justice. However, the folk justice held by many is that it may be acceptable to lie, cheat, or steal when one's dealing with those who have power or wealth based on injustice, large and evil corporations, etc. The notion that the unfortunate and the powerless should be favored in any conflict with the fortunate and the powerful is a common instinct. It's perhaps noteworthy that the Bible warns judges equally against favoring the poor as against favoring the powerful. For the present inquiry, does it affect the analysis of the moral obligation to perform one's contracts if the parties to the agreements are themselves in an unjust relationship, perhaps an exploitative employment relationship, or if they have vastly different resources in part because of past or present unjust social practices? There are, of course, some forms of exploitation or bad behavior that American contract law responds to directly, where the behavior occurs in the formation of the agreement or its performance. As I've already noted, certain forms of misrepresentation, duress, and undue influence can be grounds for rescinding an agreement. An agreement or term in agreement sufficiently unfair on both substantive and procedural grounds can be invalidated as unconscionable. And certain forms of advantage taking in the performance of the agreement will constitute a breach of the implied covenant of good faith. Additionally, as noted above, there are some forms of overreaching, though they will not ground a claim of rescission, may be basis for denying certain remedies. However, all these doctrines collectively leave a lot of room for exploitation in the agreement itself or in the relationship within which the agreement occurs. If one's employers treat one very badly at work, at some point does one's obligation to keep one's contractual obligations to the company cease or at least alter? Again, this is one of those situations where common folk understanding likely diverges from the view of ethicists. There's a common, though of course not universal, view that what one owes a bad employer is significantly less than complete compliance with one's employment contractual duties. Consider analogy. Under the law, in many places, A's financial obligation to B under one transaction can be set off against B's obligation to A under a second transaction. There's no point in imposing an obligation to pay a large sum in one direction if a comparably large or even larger obligation to pay is due in the other direction. It's better that the two be combined for a smaller sum to be paid in the appropriate direction, taking into account both obligations. One might argue that if folk thinking is comparable with contracts amid unjust relationships, while that one can take into account another's wrongful behavior in adjusting what one owes to the person or entity under an agreement. Final section. When one speaks of a moral obligation to perform, what is meant here by performance? There's an obvious sense that one performs one's contract when one does the action one has promised to do, to paint the outside walls of a house, to sing a particular role in an opera, to pay for a service after it's been completed or good after it's been delivered. A combination of the terms of the agreement and the doctrinal rules may indicate one's duty to do a promised performance may be suspended or ended by the failure of the other party to perform, or to perform adequately. But the present discussion will focus on circumstances where performance has not been suspended in this way. There is a tradition that views contracts as a kind of option agreement, that the promisor should be understood as having a choice between performing the action promised and having a certain amount of damages. This view goes back to Oliver Wendell Holmes and has been recently championed by some law and economics theorists. Under this approach, all contracts become a kind of pay or play agreement. The question thus is whether, other things being equal, one's moral obligation is properly focused on the promised performance or instead on either doing the promised performance or paying damages. If the former, then breach of contract will frequently, perhaps presumptively be immoral. If the latter, then breach of contract is never on its own immoral, at least where one promptly pays the appropriate level of damages. As to the latter position, it might still be argued that it can be immoral to force the other party to sue for damages, thereby suffering significant delays, uncertainty about recovering significant attorney's fees. Certainly, most people equate keeping a contract, just like keeping a promise, with performing as promised, and do not view prompt payment of damages for non-performance as equivalent. Just as few would see equivalent doing what is promised and apologizing promptly and sincerely for not doing what one promised. There is a stubborn intuition that performance is the primary objective of contracts, however much the remedial structure of at least American contract law might support the equivalent of performance and payment. Conclusion. Does one have an obligation to keep one's contracts? For many people, the initial inclination would be to answer yes, based on the strong association of contracts and promises, combined with the belief that other things being equal, one should keep one's promises. A closer examination of the question of the moral obligation to keep one's contracts, however, raises complications and doubts. First, many have questioned the connection between contract and promise, arguing that contracts and contract law are best understood in some other way. Second, many are inclined to think that our duty to keep our agreement varies with how far the decision to enter the agreement deviated from optimal consent, or with facts about the fairness of the background relationship or society generally. It seems likely and not terribly surprising that one's obligation to keep a contract would vary with its circumstances. injustice in society, and the underlying relationship in the negotiation of the agreement or the agreement's terms would work against any such moral obligation. If this is right, then the starting point of discussions about the moral obligation to keep contracts varies from the starting point of discussions about the moral obligation to obey the law. On the latter topic, for a long time, it was assumed that at least for generally just legal systems, a moral obligation applied equally to all laws, though one might then argue about the defeasibility of that obligation in particular cases. With contracts, people seem less inclined to assume that all contracts bind equally. There remain questions of what the content of the obligation to keep one's contract would be, assuming there is one. Most of us assume that it's an obligation actually to perform, unless there are good reasons not to. But some would argue merely for an obligation to perform or pay damages. Though the prompt payment of damages, without disputing the breach, or without claiming a lower amount of damages, or without threatening protracted and expensive litigation, would already be a significant advance on current common commercial practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I can keep a queue regarding questions. First, Will.
Well, thanks, Ryan. That was really, really interesting. I take it you're trying to suggest that there's an asymmetry between the obligation to obey the law generally and then the obligation, moral obligation to honor contracts, and that the analysis that philosophers typically employ to discuss the broader question don't apply in the case of contracts.
Well,
Is that right?
I guess the short answer is maybe. Again, the problem is there are lots of moving parts.
Yeah.
Right?
So let's assume that's kind of what you were trying to do.
I tentatively, that's sort of I point towards the end, but
Yeah.
not with great certainty.
Yeah. So I wonder whether you could make them symmetrical by. And let me back up. One of the differences you point out that you think is crucial here is that the law doesn't say honor your contracts. It says because people can just pay damages, and so there's an asymmetry there. It's not like where the law tells you don't engage in assaulting people. The contract with contracts, it doesn't say honor your contracts or don't break your contracts. It says don't break your contracts or you're going to pay damages. So why isn't the obligation to honor your contracts or pay damages as determined in some way by a court, so the asymmetry is there, and the same arguments that would apply to law generally are going to apply there. Now you might come back and you were right that it's very complicated about what are accepted as, say, valid contracts. So we could modify it, say that the law says honor your valid contracts, and then whether they're or pay damages, and then the question is which are valid, and your analysis shows that that's an extremely complicated question. And so the directive from the law to honor your contracts or pay to obey your valid contracts or pay damages is in a sense there's a defeasibility there, because if the contract's immoral in some fundamental way, then it's going to be invalid. Okay, you say the same thing about the obligation to obey the law. As you pointed out, most legal philosophers are perfectly happy to say that even in a reasonably just legal system, if you get a law that's really quite unjust, that the obligation to obey it is defeasible. So I'm just trying to reestablish the symmetry.
Well, I agree with you, and I probably should have made this clearer, that at the legal level, you can create a symmetry or a near symmetry where, don't steal, or in your contracts either perform or pay damages.
Yeah.
But the focus on the paper is different. The focus on the paper is the moral obligation. And the question is, and there's where there are lots of moving parts, right? Because the question is, what is the right answer? And it's hotly contested what the right answer is with the law, moral obligation to obey the law, where the old traditional view is there's a presumptive moral obligation to obey, defeasible if there's some emergency or some strong countervailing moral reason, et cetera.
The same can apply to contracts. I mean, your moral obligation.
It could, but I mean, the argument I'm getting at is that my sense, and again, this is armchair and apocryphal, my sense is that when you talk to people, their starting point is not starting point of presumption to keep your contracts unless there's some defeasible reason. Their starting point is it differs. It matters. It's more piece, if not one, it's not individual, at least sort of piecemeal. That my promise to the insurance company and my promise to my employer I treat differently than my promise to my neighbor. My contract with my employer, my contract with my insurance company, my contract to my neighbor.
Yeah, the moral obligation is going to be, it's establishing what it is a lot more complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so with that, I think I'm in total agreement. But I guess I just worry about the saying, well, the obligation to obey the law arguments don't have any bearing here, because I think you can.
Well, no, yeah.
You can bring it back,
if I thought
so
they were completely irrelevant, they wouldn't be in the paper.
Yeah, okay, all right.
But it's helpful. You're pushing me to clarify things I need to clarify.
Jeff?
Great. So I'm now even more persuaded, having heard all of it. But
Thank you. Okay, what's the next one?
next. If that was,
Yeah,
maybe I should talk like a Californian with a lilt at the end, so it sounds like a question.
Always beware the philosopher's butt.
So in question mark, upside down question mark, is your distinction between contractual obligations and moral ones? The proposal that there might be such a distinction.
Oh yeah.
Is it treating contractual, when you say that the contractual obligations, are they based on promissory obligations, or are they based on wealth distribution, or are they based on this or that? There's two different ways of understanding that, the normativity there. One is to say, do I have an obligation to obey, to keep a contract qua contract? And the alternative is to say, do I have an obligation, a different question rather, is to say, do I have an obligation to do what I contracted to do for moral reasons? It might not be that that's how contract law would characterize the normativity, but it might just be that whatever it is that I have an obligation to do contractually happens to function like a promise, or happens to do whatever it is that promises do, and given that the obligation to keep a promise follows on most theories from whatever it is that promises do, or whatever it is they cause, or whatever it is they invite or induce or express, then as long as a contract invites or induces or expresses the same thing, then it wouldn't the question of whether I'm obligated to keep it wouldn't be a matter of what the doctrine or practice of contract law takes itself to be or is based on, but what incidentally almost, contract law happens to involve. And you hear the same thing with tort law. So I mean, some people like Goldberg and Zapersky say there's a rule. Tort law expresses a rule, but don't assault and don't commit battery, or don't drive negligently. But most people would see even the normativity of tort law in terms that Will suggested, where the law says if you negligently injure somebody, if you wrongfully injure, you are responsible in certain ways, and it's that structure in vis-a-vis the practice of tort law. But it'll still be the case that overlapping with that will be that you shouldn't batter somebody, you shouldn't drive negligently for moral reasons. A lot of them is just a perfect overlap. So the question I wonder if the question is whether there is a moral obligation to keep things like contract corresponding to a moral obligation to obey the law, or is it whether there's a moral obligation to keep a contract qua contract law, or qua, in as much as it is a contract, or in as much as it is a law. You see what I mean? It's a slightly different.
No, I mean, I think this is what the whole paper has been about, and if it's not coming across clear enough, I need to foreground it more. But yeah, I mean, what the law says, you need to do, and when the law says you're going to have to pay damages, and when you're, are allowed to rescind the agreement, or whatever is over here, and the question is, is it, you don't have to be a hardcore American legal realist to understand that there are things you can get away with, right? And so the question is, assuming you can get away with it, morally ought you to do it anyway. Forget about the prudential concern about being put in jail, having to pay a large amount of liability, and pay a large amount of lawyers' fees, right? It's like, I'll be driving somewhere and, say, well, what about that parking spot over there? It says, oh, I can't park there. It's not allowed. And I said, look, it's the weekend. No one's going to, we're at a school, it's on the weekend, no one's going to force it. No, I can't, it's illegal, right? They get into a mindset, they don't have a deep moral understanding, moral argument about why I have a moral obligation to obey the law. It's just for convenience sake, they don't do things that are illegal, right? So, yeah, as I said in the paper, there are some agreements you would keep there anyways, because there are robust moral reasons about keeping your promises, about not upsetting other people's reasonable reliance. But there are lots of contracts where, a lot of that's not in play, or there are countervailing moral considerations, like you really didn't have a choice and these people are being complete jerks and they're treating you badly elsewhere. And when do those other bulbs and whistles change the analysis?
Sorry, one small follow-up. Yeah, right, but if all contracts were promises, not because contract law is based on promise or obligation, but because as a matter of fact, what a contract is turns out to be what a promise is. But as with promises, there are defective promises,
Yeah.
there are promise, even most promise theorists besides Kant would say it's a pro tanto obligation,
Yeah.
it's an
No,
overridable obligation.
No, but I understand the feasibility. I mean, the problem with the paper, I was hoping you guys all correct me with this and help rewrite it for me. There are lots of balls in the air. So, as you know, whether contract is promise is a big literature.
Right.
And then there's an even arguably bigger and more intricate literature of what's the normativity of promises.
Right.
So, if you could resolve one or both of those, in the next few weeks, that would help. Take those balls out of the air.
Okay, give me 5, well.
Yeah, you got a flight home, right? You got time.
Thanks. Tomás.
Thanks, Brian. It's a very interesting paper. Forgive
Will
me.
thought it was a very, really interesting paper. So I don't know if this is good.
I really liked the paper, but
Okay.
I did not get a chance to read it, so I just listened to you reading. So forgive me if my question is not. If I make a stupid question, just
Well,
I have an excuse.
No,
Okay.
it's a stupid author. The people who have read the paper still didn't get the message. So it's the author's fault.
Okay, so I've never considered this question before, so it's one of the first time I ever read or listened to an argument about this problem. So I would just share an intuition that seemed to me more plausible by listening to you. The very idea of a general moral obligation seems to obey the law or to comply with your promises or perhaps contracts. Doesn't it? I'm very skeptical about the possibility of a general answer. I think it would have to be a piecemeal approach.
I'm skeptical about it too, but keep in mind this was unquestioned consensus until roughly the 1970s. I mean, I say, going back to Plato, that's a long time.
Yeah, it is.
And included people like Rawls and Hart. It was all sort of, Rawls at some point says, obviously there's an obligation to obey the law of generally just regime. It doesn't think it's something even worth arguing about.
Yeah. But my intuition would be that there are many values at stake in every case, and you only will know the answer when the case comes. I think this is more or less the problem of promises. And I'm thinking about a paper by working on international law. It said, why should states obey the international law? I said, no, it cannot be consent cannot be the answer. There must be a constellation of values that would have to make it important that states comply with the international law. So you have to examine the whole framework to see if you can ground a principle to explain why they should obey it.
But what about promises? I mean, I think this is debated, but the notion that there is a presumptive obligation to keep your promise. Obviously, you promise to kill someone's spouse. The moral iniquity of that overcomes it. But generally, the intuitive notion that other things being equal, morally speaking, ought to keep your promises. That doesn't strike me as that bizarre.
Okay, as a prima facie or as an interpretive plateau or something like that, as a paradigm that's defeatable, because I think that perhaps a good follow-up on the discussion of your paper would be to try to explain the values at stake, so we can, in each case, try to balance these values and understand how they fit into the real problems. I'm thinking about examples here, perhaps it will help. If I promise you if we sign a contract and I say, okay, I'm selling you my house, so 3 months from now, you will have this expectation. You will commit yourself to a life project. I mean, you will make an effort to get the money. You will plan your moving. You will look for schools for your children. You, in a sense, this commitment will build your moral world, your expectation. It will be almost like an ethical decision. But let me come back now to the conversation that I had with my mobile phone company. I just asked them to change my plan. They said, okay, we'll do it, and they did not. And then again, I said, I want another number for my son, and they did not. So they failed on me several times, and I have absolutely no discretion, no commitment. I just wanted the phone to be working. So it's a very different case. So in one case, there are moral commitments, ethical decisions, roughly fairness. It was an autonomous decision, something that shapes your moral world. So I think that we have to look at these specific and particular values to find the answer.
So
perhaps
I do talk in the paper that, amongst the reasons why, forget about your general moral obligations, you would have a reason to keep particular agreements is reasonable reliance, right? I mean, which is what you're talking about. Now, let's complicate that. Just to pick a random example, there's a person who's allegedly the president of the country I live in, who apparently had a practice confirmed by many that he would promise to pay people and then he wouldn't do it. And then eventually, somewhere down the road, they'd either give up trying to get paid or they'd accept pennies on the dollar. Because if you would bring him to court, it would be very expensive. And at the end of the day, at most you'd get, after paying lawyers a lot of money and spending a lot of time, is you might get what you were owed. But you would have spent 5 times that to get it, right? So what's the reasonable reliance in our legal system where you're not punished for breaching your contract, right? Where it's, your lawyer may tell you, look, a lot of sellers renege if they get a better offer. Keep that in mind. Don't move all your family just yet, right? What counts as reasonable reliance if the court says, people don't always keep what they promise to perform. They won't be forced by the court, and they won't be punished in any significant way. In fact, you'll be punished if you try to enforce it. Our answer is, well, gosh, that's just, in your cases, that's just the way those darn phone companies are. Yeah, I have another horror story just like yours. And we know not to expect them to do what they promise to do. Right? Does that change our moral calculation? We live amongst scoundrels?
I think that in my case, I changed the company with no regret whatsoever.
And that's the only way
I did not feel morally compelled to abide with that contract. They charged me with something because I changed, but I would feel very bad with you if I could not sell your house I could not sell my house in the case of
that's why you came in academic instead of a successful business person.
Thank you.
Tengo 2 preguntas más. Usted, sí. Y después Vic, y yo creo que con eso cerramos. Hacemos un breve receso de 3 minutos máximo y continuamos con la ponencia del profesor Waluchao. Sí, adelante.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really like it. I have a little reflection about it. The law and contract law most of the time establishes its provisions based on an ideal reasonable person, equal to others with all information available, etc. You talk about it. But the general agreement is that even if it's morally unjust, a provision, you have to do it anyway, no? But
it depends how morally unjust it is.
Okay. but here in Mexico, there are provisions created by Mexican courts that let them to reduce the amount paid on when it's the case of high interest on a debt, for example, based on the evidence of inequality on the market. So, if that happens here, from where these judges actively are taking these decisions on that way, if it's not from the moral, even it is not a generalized practice.
So, I mean, even American law and even English law has provisions to try to respond to some forms of injustice, and I refer to some of them. But, you know, lots of forms of injustice the courts don't get to, or the contract law rules, contract law doctrines don't respond to. And, you know, look, if our legal system fully tracked our moral system, that'd be great. But what happens when they diverge is the question.
No sé si quieras clarificar algo en ese sentido, o si fue suficiente.
Well, it was enough for me, but I'm thinking probably it's not the law who is avoiding to do justice in the way a judge thinks justice is, but it's more an economical topic now, isn't it?
I don't know what economical topic means.
Yeah, I mean, law decisions, judge decisions are more an economical topic more than another perspective.
So what I hope I'm understanding correctly, I mean, there are times when, you know, you say, you know, I mean, Finis has discussions like this. Look, there are good moral reasons not always to have the courts making every moral calibration, because you need efficiency, you need predictability, and sometimes that overrides it. I'm fine with that. This isn't meant directly as a criticism of the legal system. It just notes that you know, the law will enforce contracts where the terms may not be optimally fair, the consent may not be optimal. And I'm asking, and again, not to criticize for the law for enforcing them, because I know there are good practical and moral reasons for doing so. But you know, each of us as individuals have moral choices to make about, someone stays late at a company that's treating them badly, and his friend says, look, I'm going home, right? And he says, look, but I promised to stay. Yeah, but look at the way they treat you, right? That person has a moral choice to make, assuming they're not likely to get caught. Should I know I promised to do it, but they're treating me really badly. Do I have a moral obligation to stay simply because I signed a contract that said I would? That's the question. We all have moral choices to make, separate from what's the right way to construct our legal system.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Vic.
Thank you, Professor Biggs. In your paper, you suggest that maybe we cannot take a view on whether we have an obligation to keep contracts without taking a position on those more fundamental questions. And with this, you are referring to the different interpretations of what is a contract. I think that you are referring to those questions.
Well, the other foundational questions are referring to are things like, how do we ever have a moral obligation? Do promises create moral obligations? Do they only create moral obligations when it increases on the utilitarian sort of calculus? When does consent create a moral obligation? When can consent be overridden? So it's not, there are as I said, there are lots of moving parts. So part of it is, let's say, is contract essentially promise, yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
If you say yes, well, when do we have an obligation to keep our promises? So, if it's not essentially promises, essentially consent, well, when is consent sufficiently imperfect that it doesn't create a moral obligation, right? So, I think we need to work at a variety of different levels, and 17 pages or 19 pages is not going to be enough to do it.
Thank you, Professor. I think that it's important to deal with the question of what is a contract. And I think that it is also important with the other question that you put in your paper, that if one concludes that there is an obligation to obey the law, then it would follow that one has an obligation to keep contracts. And I think that in this question is very important what is a contract and what is the difference between a contract and the law in general. Because if they are the same, then maybe if you have the obligation to follow the law, then you will have the obligation to follow the contract. But if they are different, then the moral considerations and the moral question if you have to keep the contract will differ also. And I think that the general idea is that if the things are different, then the moral consideration regarding these things also will be different. So I think that is why it's important to know what is a contract, or at least to say, for me, the contract is this. And
so, I mean, this goes back to stuff that is in the paper, stuff in the discussion with Professor Walucho. You know, when you think about the whole literature and the obligation to obey the law, in some ways focuses primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on criminal law, where the law says do this or don't do that. You know, to some extent, some aspects of civil law, but most of civil law isn't like that. Most of civil law is, here's what you need to do to make a valid will. Here's what you need to do to make a valid contract. We'll make our courts available for compensation. You know, obligation, you know, it's an awkward statement, which is why I end up with the even more awkward keep one's contracts. I mean, normal human beings don't talk like that. Only philosophers talk like that. You know, what is it, you know, what is the law telling you that you're either going to obey or disobey? One possibility, as we were talking about, is you must either perform or pay damages. So that's not the conventional way that people understand their agreements. But that's sort of the subliminal message, the whispered message of at least American and British contract law, is promptly paying your damages is good enough for us.
Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, le damos un agradecimiento al profesor Biggs por la ponencia. Si me pueden unir conmigo con un aplauso muy merecido al profesor Walucho, también un amigo muy querido del Instituto, y no solo del Instituto, personalmente lo considero un amigo muy, muy cercano. Y en ese sentido, ayer comentaba yo la gratitud, el agradecimiento que tenemos hacia ciertos profesores que nos han ayudado muchísimo en la revista, y sin duda uno de ellos es el profesor Walucho, que está, y tenemos la fortuna de contar con una ponencia el día de hoy. El profesor Walucho es doctor en Filosofía del Derecho por la Universidad de Oxford, dirigido nada más y nada menos que por H.L.A. Hart, y actualmente él tiene un puesto muy importante en la Universidad McMaster, que es el Senator William McMaster Chair in Constitutional Studies. Will, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. I was mentioning that yesterday I gave a really important message to my colleagues that we were really grateful for your support regarding our journal, the starting of our journal. And Mike Giudice, Brian Biggs also was an important and integral part for our journal to have the place it has today. So thank you very much for that and for accepting the invitation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Juan. The first time I came here, which was probably about 15 years ago, Juan introduced me in Spanish, and like Brian, I know very little Spanish, virtually nothing. And I said at the time, for all I know, Juan could have said, Walucho's a horse's ass. And I hope he assured me he didn't do that, and I'm hoping he didn't do that this morning. So I am honored to be here. I've probably been here at least half a dozen, 8 times, something like that. It's probably the place I've been to most in my career as a visitor, and I think it's a wonderful place. I think the people here are terrific. I think what Juan and Emer and Enrique and others have done to develop legal philosophy at UNAM is quite remarkable. I applaud them for the work they've done in Problema. It's gone from very humble beginnings to what is now, I think, one of the world's best forums for the publication of legal philosophy, and I think the editors should be and the founders should be congratulated for that. Okay, well. I'm going to read my paper. It's not too long, and I hope you can bear with me. Among the long-standing questions of legal theory is, oh, by the way, that picture, I think Emer took that picture and passed it on to us at McMaster, so I thought it was appropriate to put that one up in the first slide. Among the long-standing questions of legal theory is whether judges ever make new law when they decide legal cases. Many theorists believe that the exercise of this creative power is inevitable, and some even think it's desirable. They think this is so even in modern constitutional democracies, rooted in the common law, the type of system from which I come, where deliberation and voting among elected legislators is now widely accepted as the principal form for the creation of new law. Other legal theorists reject both the necessity and the desirability of judge-made law. Ronald Dworkin was perhaps the foremost contemporary proponent of that view and set out to develop a complex theory that purports to eliminate the need for judges ever to create new law in any problematic sense. According to Dworkin's famous right answer thesis, there is always in a mature legal system an antecedently or pre-existing right answer to any legal question on which a case might turn. And it's the duty of the judge to find and apply that answer in deciding the case before her. Now, one needn't dig too deeply to understand the reluctance of those like Dworkin who reject the necessity and the desirability of judges making law. The thought that judges create new law poses a threat to the archetypal image of the judge as an impartial, neutral arbiter, whose role essentially is to apply legal norms created elsewhere, created by individuals who possess the democratic authority to do so. In this view, justice is or ought to be blind to extra legal considerations, including all those reasons the legislators might have had to create the laws that the judges are supposed to apply in their impartial manner. In modern constitutional democracies, those who properly engage in law creation include, of course, members of elected legislatures, who are viewed as representing and furthering in their lawmaking activities the values, interests, and preferences of the electorate they were legitimately chosen to serve in elections. According to this archetypal image, a judge's reasoning should map onto what we might call a basic legal syllogism. The law provides the major premise of the relevant syllogism, a statement of the facts of the case provides its minor premise, and the conclusion states the legally right answer. It's the duty of the judge to affirm in her judgment. Now, on that picture, there both is and ought to be little room for judicial creativity. The law both does and ought to provide the antecedently existing right answer to the pivotal question on which the case turns. Questions like, is this defendant liable for committing an actionable tort? Is this defendant guilty of a crime? Is this contract legally valid? Is this statute constitutionally valid? Has this constitutional right been violated? And so on. So those are what I call pivotal questions. Now, despite this archetypal image, most deny that it and the basic syllogism it embraces accurately reflects the judicial reasoning that actually goes on in most legal cases. Legal realists are often characterized as denying the image entirely, suggesting instead that the law never fully determines the conclusions reached by judges, both in practice and in theory. Rather, a host of non-legal factors significantly contribute to or determine the outcome of any case. These include the judge's own individual sense of fairness, her broader, possibly quite partisan convictions of political morality, or political pressure from some other government or non-government body. Now, this is so even in cases where there appears to be a singular legal rule, which itself seems to supply the required right answer. In any such case, the realist will say, the rule requires interpretation. And as this character, English Bishop Benjamin Hoadley famously said, quote, "Whoever hath an absolute authority to interpret written or spoken laws, it's he who is truly the lawgiver to all intents and purposes, and not the person who wrote or spoke them." Now, one doesn't have to embrace an extreme form of legal realism in order to deny the archetypal image, to deny that it fully captures the nature of all judicial decision-making. Many less skeptical scholars and judges believe that judges are inevitably required in some cases to fill in gaps or indeterminacies left by the law and its makers in their effort to supply judges with their major premises. And in so doing, they employ a mode of reasoning commonly referred to as judicial discretion. Theorists as vastly different as Aquinas, Austin, Kelsen, Hart, all accept that there are inevitably cases where the law, so to speak, runs out. And the judge must, of necessity, exercise a kind of lawmaking discretion in supplying, supplementing, or specifying the missing or incomplete major premise of the relevant basic syllogism. But as I noted earlier, not all theorists think that this is inevitable, let alone desirable. They don't think it's necessarily inevitable that judges should sometimes be called on to create new law in this particular way. After distinguishing two innocuous forms of weak discretion, one having to do with the use of judgment, the other with the finality of the decision made, Dworkin distinguishes, as we all know, a third sense, what he calls strong discretion, and argues that its exercise is far from inevitable. Strong discretion is characterized by the judge's freedom to step beyond the confines of authoritatively binding legal norms for extra-legal grounds on which to decide a case. For example, it might appeal to the principles of morality or principles of economic efficiency or something else. In that kind of circumstance, the law fails to provide a uniquely right answer, and the judge is free to create new law by drawing on whatever grounds she sees fit to consider. Now, it's that third strong sense of discretion that Dworkin denies is necessary, let alone desirable. In constitutional democracies like the United States, Canada, and Mexico, that's desirable in constitutional democracies like the US, Canada, and Mexico. If the coercive measures the law purports to license are to be justified in such systems, Dworkin reasons, the law must be what he calls a seamless web, in which antecedently existing legally right answers can always be found by judges. Not always easily, but they can be found. They're there to be found. Now, were such right answers not always available, and judges were instead allowed to create new law, the costs would be too great. These include a loss of democratic legitimacy and a failure to respect basic fairness. Democratic legitimacy would be sacrificed because, as the archetypal image suggests, as I noted earlier, the role of the judge in a democracy that embraces the separation of powers is to be an impartial arbiter who renders decisions according to standards set by other people, these other people with the democratic authority to create them. Fairness is compromised because it demands that we be judged by application of law that existed at the time we acted, and this be used as the major premise in the basic syllogism on which our fate turns. But if the judge is creating new law and then applying it, the law didn't exist when we acted. And the same might be said about the rule of law. It may require antecedently existing answers. Now, these concerns about judicial creativity are particularly acute in constitutional rights cases, where courts assess legislation for conformity with abstractly worded constitutional rights. Here it seems the law often fails to provide the pre-existing right answers seemingly required for focus on democratic legitimacy. More specifically, it fails to provide right answers to contestable questions concerning the meaning and implication of abstract constitutional provisions that make reference to concepts like equality, freedom, and dignity. Now, according to one influential point of view, these are contentious moral questions, best dealt with and settled by our elected legislators, not the discretionary decisions of judges. Suppose that Congress has introduced legislation that the Supreme Court later strikes down because of a perceived conflict with one of these highly contested constitutional rights. Now, in taking that step, the court not only announces its disagreement with Congress about the compatibility of its legislation with the constitutional right, in many systems, and I think Mexico's included, it has the power to override Congress's understanding of that right and substitute its own view of the matter. But on what basis could such a substitution be justified, we might ask? Without pre-existing democratically authorized right answers to these questions for the judges to find and apply, what does equality mean here, for example, the worry is that constitutional review substitutes rule by the people with rule by appointed judges. And this worry is enough to convince many scholars and citizens that we should do away with the practice entirely. That's Jeremy Waldron's view. Now, my aim in this presentation is to raise questions about the need for these antecedently existing right answers to all pivotal legal questions. Put another way, my aim is to question whether the exercise of judicial discretion in answering pivotal questions is necessarily illegitimate in a constitutional democracy like ours. And what I'm going to argue is that legitimacy may not necessitate existing right answers and a rejection of judicial discretion. Now, many factors are relevant in addressing that issue. Some of them I consider in a longer version of this paper, which I'm not presenting today. But the one I'm going to focus on here is the fact that judicial discretion need not be the unbridled free choice. Many people seem to assume it is. It's certainly not the sort of decision-making suggested by phrases like the sovereign prerogative of choice. That was how Oliver Wendell Holmes described it. Where judicial discretion, as Holmes's phrase suggests, sovereign prerogative of choice. Decide in any way you see fit. Judicial law creation would, I think, be worrisome because it would seem to allow judges to pursue their own moral views and perhaps partisan policy preferences. Maybe even anything would go. But this common view of discretionary law creation is, I think, highly misleading. As Ronald Dworkin himself once remarked, discretion is not tantamount to license. And as my academic hero, H.L.A. Hart, observed, it certainly doesn't permit what Hart called blind, arbitrary choice. As we're going to see, it requires, at least within the confines of a reasonably healthy, stable constitutional democracy, the observance of a range of limitations on the types of reasons to which the judge may appeal, and on the type of reasoning in which the judge may legitimately engage when exercising discretionary choice in creating new law. That, I think, makes a crucial difference. When the appropriate limitations are observed, I want to suggest, democratic legitimacy need not be compromised, at least in any serious way, by judge-made law. So what are the conditions of legitimacy in such cases, cases where judges are exercising their discretion to create new law. I begin with two quotations. These are the quotations that inspired this talk, actually. The first is by Hart, who observes that, quote, judges are not confined to the alternatives of blind arbitrary choice or mechanical deduction from rules with predetermined meaning. Judicial decision, especially on matters of high constitutional import, often involve a choice between moral values. At this point, judges may again make a choice which is neither arbitrary nor mechanical, and here often display characteristic judicial virtues, the special appropriateness of which to legal decision explains why some feel reluctant to call such judicial activity, discretion, legislative. These virtues are impartiality and neutrality in surveying the alternatives, consideration for the interests of all who will be affected, and a concern to deploy some acceptable general principle as a reasoned basis for decision. Now, no doubt, he goes on to add, because a plurality of such principles is always possible, it cannot be demonstrated that a decision is uniquely correct, but it may be made acceptable, he said, as a reasoned product of informed, impartial choice. In all this, we have the weighing and balancing characteristic of the effort to do justice between competing interests. Okay, there's a lot buried in there. What I try to do is unpack it. Now consider the following statement, a statement that was endorsed by well over 2,400 U.S. law professors in a letter urging the U.S. Senate to reject Donald Trump's nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court. This letter included the following. Judicial temperament is one of the most important qualities of a judge. As the Congressional Research Service explains, a judge requires a personality that is even-handed, unbiased, impartial, courteous yet firm, and dedicated to process, not a result. Now, these two passages can, I think, serve as a useful starting point in a search for conditions under which the exercise of discretionary judgment in constitutional rights cases might be legitimate. Such an exercise might be legitimate if it is, and here I've got eight conditions here. This is just a first crack at them. An exercise of discretionary judgment can be legitimate if it's not arbitrary, impartial and neutral in surveying the alternatives, one that gives equal consideration to the interests of all affected parties, is based on a general principle or set of principles that extends by its terms to cases beyond the one being decided. And to these we might add, must be based on sound reasoning, offered from the point of view of the community's legal system and its constitutional practices and commitments, what in other work I call the community's constitutional morality. 7, it must be respectful of what Rawls calls the duty of civility. And last, but by no means least, echoing a phrase used in the law professor's letter, it should be dedicated to process, not result. Now, let me just say a few words to unpack these conditions a little bit. They're just preliminary comments, some of which are fairly uncontroversial and in little need of explanation. Take condition 5, based on sound reasoning. That's more or less self-explanatory. In exercising judgment under conditions of uncertainty, judges should try as best they can to ensure that their arguments are sound according to ordinary accepted standards of reasoning, applicable to, say, the natural and social sciences, and to discourse and argumentation more broadly construed. To say that a discretionary decision must not be arbitrary, that's condition 1, is essentially to say that it must be based on reasons. As Simon Blackburn notes in relation to the reasoned basis of morality, quote, "Perhaps there cannot be laws without a lawgiver, but Plato tells us that the ethical laws cannot be the arbitrary whims of personalized gods." End of quote. What he means here, I think, is this: even the gods must have the reasons for the norms that they prescribe. The same is true of discretionary judgments by judges in constitutional rights cases. If a choice is to be made between one understanding of a constitutional right and another, some reason has to be provided for that choice. But of course, not any old reason will do. Rendering a decision based on a coin flip is ruled out, arguably by condition 4. It has to be based on a general principle that extends beyond the present case. So too is a decision based on pure personal preference. The fact that the judge prefers A over B, or that A is to the advantage of the judge or others with whom she identifies, perhaps politically, is not an acceptable reason. The point extends to cases where the reason given is that the decision accords with the judge's own personal moral beliefs about what should be the case. Have to remember that judges play a public role in which their decisions must be publicly justifiable. In other words, they must be justifiable to those affected by those decisions. And the sheer fact that one decision is as opposed to another accords with her own personal moral beliefs or those of some group of persons, for example, members of a particular political party who share the judge's political leanings, offers no such justification. Now let me just explain what in the heck that image is all about. This was a local Hamilton, Ontario judge. I'm from Hamilton, Ontario, who waltzed into court the day after Donald Trump was elected with that hat on. And not surprisingly, he was roundly condemned for that because it betrayed a kind of a political position that he was apparently subscribed to, and it threatened the perception of impartiality on the part of that judge. He was suspended for a period of time, claimed it was only a joke. He didn't really intend to show any support to Trump or Trump's policies, but he did it. And I think he was properly chastised for having done so. Okay, to return to the paper. Now, the exclusions I've just listed are quite minimal about what kinds of reasons can't be used. They tell us a bit about the range of acceptable reasons for judgment. But fortunately, I think my list of conditions offers considerably more guidance. Condition 4, that reasons be based on a general principle, demands that the factors considered in rendering the decision extend beyond the case in question. Okay, this was taken from the Hart quote. Faithful observance of this condition is one way, I think, to minimize the chances that purely personal or partisan reasons are at play. If a reason R is a good reason for a decision in circumstances C, then it's an equally good reason for that very same decision in any other similar case, real or hypothetical, in which those same circumstances C obtain. As R.M. Hare, famous Oxford moral philosopher, famously argued, a decision maker may accept a reason for a decision only if she's willing to accept its implications for her own situation, should she or anyone else she cares about be in a position to be adversely affected by that decision. Or as Kant put it, I must be prepared to will as a universal law that applies equally to me, as well as all others, the maxim on which I act. Now that feature of reasoned judgment is one that Rawls also seeks to capture, I think, when he introduces us to his famous original position, where each rational contractor is denied personal information upon the basis of which she might choose principles that work to her own personal advantage, or to the advantage of those with whom she shares a special bond. In thinking about how judges should decide hard, controversial constitutional rights cases where they are exercising their discretion, we might view them as occupying a role analogous to Rawls' contractors. There will be differences, of course. Among the most important of these, the focus of my sixth condition, is that the facts to which the judges have access include relevant facts of constitutional practice and history, with which they must reconcile their decisions. Complying with condition 4 also inclines one toward observance of conditions 2 and 3, that the decision maker be impartial and neutral in surveying the alternatives, and that she give equal consideration to the interests of all affected parties. Basing a decision on reasons that extend beyond the case at hand and that apply to real or hypothetical situations where the judge might be adversely affected will go some way toward helping ensuring impartiality, if the judge is in good faith attempting to act in accordance with this stricture. It will help to ensure that her decisions will be even-handed, unbiased, and impartial. Condition 6, my sixth condition, that a discretionary decision be offered from the point of view of the community's legal system and its constitutional practices and commitments, is one, as I said, which I elaborate at much greater length elsewhere, and I'm not going to bore you with the details here. Though made by individual judges, legal decisions, discretionary or otherwise, are undertaken in fulfillment of a public role, a role that usually requires a kind of detached decision-making that's detached from the judge's own personal preferences, and that the archetypal image was at least partly meant to represent. Now, despite the fact that it's faulty in all kinds of ways, the archetypal image does capture one important truth. In reasonably healthy democratic democracies, judges are required to decide cases not in terms of their own personal beliefs and commitments, but of those ascribable to the democratic community they serve. This is a point Dworkin meant to capture in requiring that the legal theory of his ideal Judge Hercules fit the settled law. It would be seriously wrong for Hercules, or any other judge in a reasonably just legal system, to ignore her community's constitutional practices and prior commitments in deciding a case, and to rely exclusively on her own personal moral beliefs and preferences. If the law fails to provide a clear answer to the constitutional question at hand, it's nevertheless incumbent upon the judge to draw on other norms and commitments of her community in providing one. More specifically, she must attempt to draw on the fundamental norms and commitments embodied in her community's constitutional practices. And these will quite often rule out options the judge might personally have preferred. A judge who, for his own moral or partisan political reasons, ignores the constraints imposed by his community's constitutional history and its commitments, more often than not steps beyond the boundaries of legitimacy. Her discretionary decision, even if it's morally justified in the abstract, fails the test of legitimacy, I think, for one whose role is to serve her community and to decide in terms of its standards, not hers. Now, condition 7, that the judge respect the duty of civility, in effect follows from the considerations I've just discussed, I think. As Rawls repeatedly stressed in his later writings, reasonable people of good faith and integrity disagree deeply on many moral issues, including those round which constitutional rights cases revolve. And yet they realize that much of their life in common requires shared standards of governance of their conduct. Now, legislative choices create many of those common standards, and judicial decisions normally set out to implement and sometimes supplement them. But constitutional review cases are often ones in which some of those legislative choices are actually rejected. In those exceptionally rare cases where everyone agrees that a constitutional rights provision has been clearly and undeniably violated by the legislative choice, most of us would be comfortable with a court's decision to strike it down. The court would simply be enforcing superior law in that case. Real questions of legitimacy arise only in those much more typical cases where uncertainty and disagreement reign, and where judges are called on to exercise discretionary judgment in choosing among rival understandings of the relevant constitutional right. Condition 7 reminds judges that their decisions set standards for our common life together. It reminds them that in the face of reasonable pluralism and uncertainty, it's important that they base their decisions, their discretionary decisions, on reasons each of us can at least recognize as acceptable reasons, if not always fully embraced reasons, as a basis for establishing a common standard for all of us. Though these will not always be reasons each of us will particularly like or think ideally best, they should nevertheless be reasons we can at least recognize as acceptable ones under the circumstances. In alluding to that fact, Condition 7 invokes Rawls' notion of public reason and the ideal of reciprocity or civility it embodies. As Rawls puts it, this ideal expresses a willingness to listen to what others have to say and being ready to accept reasonable accommodations or alterations in one's own view. Public reason further asks of us that the balance of those values we hold to be reasonable in a particular case is a balance we sincerely think that can be seen as reasonable by others. At least we're making that effort. Or failing this, we think the balance can be seen as at least not unreasonable in this sense, that those who oppose it can nevertheless understand at least how reasonable persons could affirm it, particularly ones who are charged with setting common standards in conditions of reasonable pluralism and disagreement. This, he says, preserves the ties of civic friendship and is consistent with the duty of civility. And then he adds, I think this is important for our purposes, on some questions, this may be the best we can do. So to summarize, Condition 7 demands that judges base their decisions on reasons that everyone else could accept as a reasonable basis for a decision, given the circumstances in which the decision has to be made. As a result, it excludes reasons tied deeply to comprehensive ideologies and doctrines not all of us share, and that would be labeled by some of us as unreasonable. In Rawls' view, it excludes reliance on religious reasons and reasons stemming from controversial moral and political theories. We can quibble about all that. To be sure, the surviving reasons are not necessarily ones everyone would prefer, even under ideal conditions of deliberation and choice. Nor are they reasons which every reasonable person in such circumstances would consider particularly strong or ideally worthy of support, but for the fact of reasonable pluralism and the need to come to some sort of mutually acceptable compromise. But they are reasons, as Rawls would have it, that such persons would all judge to be at the very least not unreasonable, in the sense that those who oppose them could at least understand, again, how reasonable persons could affirm them, in justifying an exercise of public power in the circumstances of reasonable pluralism and our deep uncertainty about the moral matters our constitutional controversies concern. In drawing exclusively from such reasons, or attempting to do so, judges, quote, must cast their constitutional arguments in ways that might appeal to reasonable dissenters. A person who's willing to be persuaded by the better argument assumes that reasonable moral disagreement will characterize difficult constitutional cases and will conclude that the act in question is publicly justified only when the state has produced sufficiently public reasons on its behalf. That's a quotation from Rawls. Public reasons so construed, again, Rawls, are typically as neutral as possible, with respect to the wide range of reasonable conceptions of the good and normative political ideologies that currently exist in the community. They should be uncontroversial, which means that an ideal reasonable person could not reasonably reject them. In case anybody's wondering, that's not one of my grandchildren. Those are my grandchildren. I had to take the opportunity to show them off. Top left, that's Abigail. She's 3 years old. Her sister Evelyn is 2 beside her. Our 7-month-old darling Lily is in the bottom left-hand corner, and that's our little James, wearing his Toronto Blue Jays cap in the swing. I was pushing him on the swing, and he was just having a great time. That's my hat, by the way. I gave it to him because his kept falling off. Now, this brings us to the 8th and final condition on the list, the requirement that judges be dedicated to process, not result. And that returns us once again to the archetypal image of the judge with which we began. Now, if the archetypal image accurately captured the reality of all constitutional rights cases, in other words, if the law somehow always provided judges with clear major premises from which they could deduce a legally right answer to the relevant pivotal question in the constitutional rights case, then it would be fair to characterize judging, even in constitutional rights cases, as requiring little more than the neutral, impartial derivation of the legally right result flowing from the basic legal syllogism. In that scenario, a judge's concern would be, or at least should be, to achieve the right result. Process might be important, but her primary responsibility would be to ensure that she got the right result. But of course, the archetypal image fails miserably to capture the true nature of judging in virtually all constitutional rights cases. In light of the uncertainty and deep disagreement surrounding such a case, we can't, I think, reasonably ask our judges to get the right results. That's just not something we can reasonably ask. And that's because none of us can be sure in any particular case whether there actually is a right answer, let alone what it might be, if indeed it does exist. What we can ask, however, is that judges observe the right processes of reasoning, the right process of reasoning, a process meant to be captured, at least partially, by the 8 conditions of legitimacy I just outlined. And we can also ask that those chosen to judge our conduct and our laws display the judicial virtues embodied in those conditions. Now, at his Supreme Court confirmation hearings, in which serious allegations of sexual assault were brought against him, Brett Kavanaugh had this to say. This is a photo from him at his confirmation hearings. This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump in this 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups. This, he said, is a circus. The consequences will extend long past my nomination. And this, and perhaps the most shocking statement, and as we all know in the United States political system of the early 2000s, what goes around comes around. This is hardly the stuff of dispassionate, even-handed, impartial deliberation that I have been arguing for. In describing his former acquaintance, Robert Post, the former dean of the Yale Law School, put the point this way. He said, his performance is indelibly etched in the public mind. For as long as Kavanaugh sits on the court, he will remain a symbol of partisan anger, a haunting reminder that behind the smiling face of judicial benevolence lies the force of an urgent will to power. Very Nietzschean sounding. No one who felt the force of that anger could possibly believe that Kavanaugh might actually be a detached and impartial judge. Kavanaugh will thus join the court as the black-robed embodiment of raw partisan power, inconsistent with any ideal of an impartial judiciary. His very presence will undermine the court's claim to legitimacy. It will damage the nation's commitment to the rule of law. It will be, he said, an American tragedy. Now, that a person so obviously lacking in the judicial virtues embodied in my 8 conditions could make it to the U.S. Supreme Court is, to put it mildly, troubling. It only serves to strengthen concerns about the American political system and many political systems around the world, and the rampant partisanship and tribalism that threaten to undermine the legitimacy of the courts and their decisions. One can only hope that Kavanaugh's appointment will spark a renewed interest among all of those who embrace the ideals of constitutional democracy, wherever they reside, in ensuring that the men and women who are selected to sit in judgment of our conduct and our laws are not ones for whom securing the right partisan result counts more than honoring the right process. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti, Will. I can keep a queue on questions. So I have Brian, then Jeff. May I put Jeff first because he might have to leave to catch a flight. Jeff, then Thomas, then Vic.
Brian, do you mind?
Then Enrique.
So,
Hope you don't mind, Thomas. Okay. So Jeff, you first, then Brian, then Thomas, Vic, and then Enrique. Those are the ones I have on queue. Then Eamon, and then Sandra.
Oh, it's not that bad.
So it's might as well just go each and every row. Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
So, great. One more chance you've given us to sort of ingeniously have our cake and eat it too. In this case, the cake of democratic legitimacy and the eating of the judicial discretion. So I very much appreciate.
That's a good one. I really like that.
And I would just a minor proposal. I feel as though there's an elaboration of your 8 conditions that actually might be an important 9th one. You might want to spell out, which is the you call it was in the discussion of neutrality, but you talked about it should be based on principles that are ascribable to the community. There's a great book by Frank Michelman called Brennan and Democracy, who describes Brennan as having done just that. That where Brennan found, because of indeterminacy or whatever it is, the laws ran out, he made a point or at least as Michelman reasoned, Brennan made a point in the Warren Court of making sure that his own discretion was guided by. He kind of became like a sociologist, kind of a pollster almost, checking what the norms of the community were.
Right.
If you leave that out, you get people who might have something that Hart or Waldron would call the rule of law. The principle would be general and neutral and impartial, something that that's not just a personal belief, one that they believe applies to all, but it could still be a rather biased or rather. So you might have a belief about what marriage is, and I say the practice of marriage means it applies to everybody. It's what I'll bet the majority think, and it's not arbitrary, and it applies. It's case neutral. It's respectful and all that, but it's not. So it might meet your 8 conditions. If I think marriage is a universal and universalizable principle and I think it with sufficient neutrality it might meet your 8, but I think it would fail that elaboration that you described. And in that way, I think that elaboration is crucial, basically. Yeah. It's not just any general principle, and it's not just any even neutral general principle, but it's one that has that slightly surveying, political checking constraint on it, which I think you very nicely described in the elaboration. So I would just want it. I'd want it more in the foreground, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that, and thanks for the reference. I'll look that up. As people here know, I've actually had a lot to say about all that in the theory that I've been developing over the years, which refers to what I call the community's constitutional morality. Now, it isn't something you get by a sociological inquiry, but it's something that you can ascribe to the community, And it's a very complex question, complex theory about how you get those, that community going. But the point is that it does serve to check significantly the pursuit of justice in the abstract, which is what you're claiming is a threat here. And if I were to flesh this paper out, I would be drawing on that all that work I did. Plus, I'm going to look up the Michelman book, and there are a few others too that pursue this this particular line as a way of checking the discretionary decisions. But I take your point that I should probably foreground that a little bit more, and I think it's absolutely vital. Otherwise, legitimacy is really problematic. Yeah.
Brian.
Yeah, it's a wonderful paper as always. In some ways, we've all been down this road before. The American legal realists who said, law does not determine the outcomes, or at least, as a description of how judges actually decide. All this extraneous stuff determine outcomes, and then the response to that was the legal process movement, to some extent, Lon Fuller, and a good chunk of what you're elaborating here seems to parallel Herbert Wechsler's idea about neutral principles.
Yeah, actually, I think that's absolutely right. I was attracted by the Wechsler position early on when I was developing my views about constitutional morality. And
I would just encourage you to show the parallels with Wechsler, show the parallels with some of the other stuff going on in the legal process, and how this fits into the history of the jurisprudential debate.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Thomas.
Thanks, Will, for the excellent paper. It's a little bit different from the one you presented
Is it
in
different?
Belen.
Oh, good.
It's not
I'm glad
the same
it's
one.
different from the one I gave in Belen.
But the basic idea of detached statements and your original views on communities' constitutional morality were there too. But I think that this one was more developed and more looking to the practical side of it. So my point is that perhaps you don't need the negative part of the paper, the part that you say the working is wrong, there's no right answer. Perhaps all that you need is the 8 conditions and the commitment to process and the kind of judicial ethics that you are proposing here, which I fully agree. And I think that no decent to Workinian would disagree with you on the positive side of the paper, the proposals, and the theory of interpretation that you develop. Because why I think that you might wish to drop the criticism on the working, because I don't read it as a metaphysical claim when he says the judge look for a right answer. He's not making a metaphysical claim that there is a right answer. I read it as more like a pragmatic commitment. Yeah. And in this sense, my response to you would be that the participants of the process, individually, they would all be committed to a certain interpretive attitude. And in this interpretive attitude, it is included an assumption that there is a correct answer, because otherwise it would not be intelligible for them to pursue in the search for the answer. It may be the case that we fail in this pursuit. It may be the case that we follow the process, we follow the ethics, we follow the proper theory of interpretation, and in the end of the day, we fail. Even Working admits this possibility, where he admits the possibility of internal skepticism. So I think that we are finally in the same team, and I'm very glad for that.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be one of these situations where I'm going to give the kind of response that I really hate hearing, which is that I dealt with that in the other part of the paper. You're absolutely right. I don't need to worry myself with the question of whether there really is a right answer. In fact, that's what I argue in the first part of the paper. It's because I got thinking about it, And I'm attracted by the view that you ascribe to Dworkin, that whether there is a right answer, the process of thinking through it presupposes you're trying to find one. And that process can make sense whether or not in the individual case there is a right answer or not. And whether or not some smart aleck philosopher can come along and say, look, really, in truth, there are cases where there isn't a right answer. And you might say, I don't care. That's the thrust of my paper, that it doesn't really matter. And I argue for that in the first part of the paper, where I say we operate under what I call the epistemic condition, where we can't, in most cases, we don't know whether there's a right answer or not. And so it doesn't make sense to say that judges should reason in one way when there's a right answer and reason in another way when there is no right answer, because we don't know whether the case is like that. So the only reasonable thing to do is to have them reason in the same way, regardless of whether there is a right answer, and therefore the metaphysical question becomes totally irrelevant. And that what you should be doing is, whether in any case, whether you believe there's a right answer or not, and whether other people agree with you on that, you observe the 8 conditions, and you'll get legitimacy. So whether this means I'm a Dworkinian now, I don't feel comfortable with that. Let me just say this: there's a lot in Dworkin with which I agree, and there are certain things I don't agree with. But on this particular matter, I think I'm in agreement. So in this particular fight, we are in the same camp.
Can I just add something? I use a view to criticize Postuma in my response to the idea of Protestant interpretation, because I said that Will Wallach read from the start Dworkin correctly. Because Postuma would claim that the idea of Protestant interpretation means that the judge can impose his own private interpretation upon the practice. And I said, no, the point of the practice is found within the practice. And Dworkin knew that. Yeah. And Wallach warned us 20 or 30 years ago that this was the right way to read Dworkin.
Yeah. Thank you.
Vic.
Thank you, Professor Walucho. I was really going to say something like Thomas. I agree with him. I think that Dworkin was not dedicated to a result, but rather a process. So I think also that Dworkin was fulfilling your 8th condition. And I have a little quote that I would like to read of Hard Cases, in which he says, on the contrary, the argument supposes that reasonable lawyers and judges will often disagree about legal rights, just as citizens and statesmen disagree about political rights. This chapter describes the questions that judges and lawyers must put to themselves, but it does not guarantee that they will all give these questions the same answer. So I think that in this quote, it's clear that Dworkin is thinking about more a process than a result. I think that he will not say that the legally right answers can always be found by judges, but that the right answer can be reached only by Hercules with all his superpowers and his superhuman abilities. And maybe if you apply the idea of Hercules to your 8 conditions, maybe you could get compromised with the metaphysical claim of the right answer. Maybe if someone has unlimited empirical and logical reasoning and can accomplish with all the other conditions in the way that Hercules can do it, I think that maybe you can claim the metaphysical right answer.
Yeah, I agree. It's conceivable, but I've now come more firmly to the view that it doesn't matter. And as I said, that's what I argue in the first part of the paper. Given that, first of all, for any particular case, there will be disagreement about whether there is a right answer, and disagreement about whether it's this answer versus that answer, even if both parties believe there is a right answer and they think they've got it, or whether the parties to the case think, no, there's no right answer. We just have to come up with a reasonable one that satisfies the 8 conditions. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we observe these conditions in coming to the decision, and you follow these conditions regardless of whether you believe that there's a right answer or not.
If I can make a follow-up, I think that maybe it matters in the case where you find 2 solutions that both satisfy these 8 conditions, and maybe if you are compromised with the assumption that there might be a right answer, maybe the people engaged in the debate will try further to find the correct answer. And if you don't keep that idea as a presupposition or as an assumption, then maybe you will say, well, we have these 2 decisions, both have been made following the 8 conditions, so it is the same if we follow A or B. But maybe if you keep that idea of the right answer thesis as a presupposition, you will try harder to find which one of those is correct, maybe.
It's possible, yeah.
Gracias, Vic. Enrique tengo aquí en la lista.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I got 2 questions. The first one has to do with the scope of your analysis. Would you consider that these 8 conditions of legitimacy you have outlined in your paper might be applied to the actions of every single authority of the legal system, not only justices of the Supreme Court, but also a policeman, administrative officials, and so on, to comply with these conditions? The second question is about the difference between legitimacy and legality. I'm asking this because I believe that a question of legitimacy often requires moral and political considerations in order to be solved. And on the other hand, the question of legality requires that official decisions fulfill legal requirements in order to be legally valid. So I am thinking also in the 8 conditions exposed by Professor Lon Fuller's 8 conditions of legality, and what is the relation of your proposal with this 8 conditions of legality?
I'll just answer that last part. I haven't really thought about that much. I probably should, and I will look at that, and I will look at Wexler and the legal process people as well in a little more detail. The first part of your question was whether the 8 conditions apply to any person in authority.
Every single authority.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how to answer that right now.
Any person in authority, even in easy cases, or persons in authority in hard cases?
Every case, easy cases,
Okay,
hard cases.
Any legal authority?
Yes.
Yeah.
So basically any judge, or are you extending it beyond?
Administrative officials in taking decisions, because there are many officials.
Yeah, I think that, I'm going to say I think so. There may be variations. For example, number 6. You might have, if you're a lower official who's bound more strictly by precedents set by higher courts or something like that, or if you're an administrative official who has a very narrowly circumscribed sphere of decision making, you can't step beyond that. That would be another additional factor that would have to be put in play here. I was thinking more of the Supreme Court, where they don't have those kinds of constraints. But if you're talking about administrative officials, I think, yeah, there have to be some kind of further circumscribing of the reasons that they could draw upon given their authorization, the type of decision they're authorized to make. That would have to be built in there too. Lower court judges, they would presumably, I think they'd probably follow the same 8 conditions, but more deference would have to be paid to authority, I think, than with higher court judges. But yeah, that's just a very good question whether it applies more broadly. The paper was written with Supreme Courts in mind, but it could easily extend to other sorts of cases too. Thank you.
Imer y después Sandra.
Regarding this last point, I think in condition number 1, not arbitrary, I guess you can more or less fit all the other deference to legislatures, to other judges, to higher court, to lower court. And so on.
Maybe.
So that's just jumping into that part. I have a similar feeling of reading the paper as the other ones, I think. I like it very much. It's always very provocative. I have the feeling, as I have always pushed Willing, saying that he's a closet Durkheimian. But I know you don't want to push the right answer thesis. And the thing is, it cannot be demonstrated. And Dworkin agrees on that.
Yeah.
He says, but that's different than indetermination.
Yeah.
And Dworkin emphasizes the idea
I know.
that we have
I'm in agreement with all that.
I know, but I think it's very important to keep that in mind because it's not only the pre-existing right answer, but it's the pre-existing rights and duties which the judge has to enforce. So the choice, the element of choice, the strong discretion, I think Hart is wrong in that sense, and I have been pushing a distinction following Roger Scheiner as well, on the inventive choice, legislative choice, that's the hard, strong discretion sense, and the interpretative choice, the interpretative sense of discretion, not necessarily choice, which is the one that neglects the pre-existing rights and duties. So get rid of choice, get into the weak discretion, the interpretative side, not necessarily the inventive legislative. But my feeling is that you don't need to go into that discussion, as I think Thomas said, for this paper, or who decide. You can go, I guess, directly into which are your conditions for this kind of reasoning and justification and so on. And I'm also, I have the feeling that so somehow the reference to Dworkin and to Hart in that debate, I think it's not necessary for your purposes. I don't think Dworkin will subscribe the idea of the basic syllogism at all. And Hart is also criticizing that for the formalism versus the rule exclusivity. So I think that's, but again, and the Kavanaugh part, I completely see the rhetorical use of it. But I also think it's not necessary to be there. I think it's in unnecessary roughness. Yes. I know. And I know, and I have the perfect word for that. It's
that was nice.
Yeah, no, but I think it doesn't
part
help
of the
your
inspiration
argument
for the paper, actually.
But for the presentation is fine. But for the paper, I think it's necessary because it goes into the political parties and the partisan discussion. Whereas I think we have to move away from and make the point of neutrality and impartiality and non-arbitrariness and so on. I think there are stronger points that making. And I think it's unnecessary roughness. And I think even though it's fun, I agree for the presentation purpose.
Roughness?
Yeah, that's
15 yards, huh?
Yeah, but let me say, I know in hockey it will be deca.
It'll be what?
Deca, when you run into the other guy and you penalty. Not necessarily the penalty, but the fact of running into the other hockey player. Deca. I don't know what that's
interference.
Okay, any of those. I know it's fun, but I think that's not necessarily the side into which would you want to go.
Discharging, maybe that's what you're saying.
So I think more into the constitutional morality and so on, I think that's the important part. And I also have the feeling that you were becoming another sort of Hartian.
Another what?
Sort of Hartian. The Henry Hart and Albert Sachs sort. The Herbert, you can still be Herbert Wessler, and you can be even Fullerian. And so, as I always say,
So I'm abandoning old Herbert Hart.
yeah,
That's what you're saying.
that sounds.
No, I don't. Yeah, we need to have a heart-to-heart.
So that's
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, I took my inspiration from that quotation from Hart, and I agree with you that it's wrong to think of discretion as legislative. Right? In fact, Hart cautioned against that. He said, because these decisions have to observe all these conditions, that's why many people are uncomfortable with calling it legislative, and I agree with that. What you call interpretive, as opposed to discretionary, I'm still happy to call it discretion. I just don't think it's not the freewheeling, anything goes kind of decision making that it's often characterized as. I have no trouble with continuing to call it discretion and not saying it's interpretive.
Legitimate discretion.
Legitimate discretion, that's right. Discretion, yeah. I mean, it is true that at times Hart just makes it sound as if when judges are exercising discretion, they just step away and and make their decisions. Law runs out.
And I think that's.
Well, law runs out, but then these 8 conditions kick in. That's the point.
Okay. And in that sense, you're moving away from Hart.
No, I'm not. I'm elaborating.
I think that's not compatible. You cannot have the cake and eat it too.
Look, I gave you the quotation, Emer. It's from Hart.
I think that's incompatible with the legislative part, and I think that's a way of getting away from the legislative and quasi-legislative.
He explicitly warns against thinking of it as legislative, but it is creative nonetheless, and that I'm trying to capture.
Interpretive, that's I think.
Yeah, okay, well you can call it what you want. I'm going to continue to call it discretion. Now,
inventive still. Legislative still.
I forget, there were a couple other questions you had buried in those long comments, but I can't remember what they are now. The Kavanaugh thing. Yeah, that was in there just for fun and it was also partly what inspired this paper. Right? It made me think about all the things that judges can do that are wrong, and the kinds of concerns people have. Now what was it? The reason I had all the stuff in there about the right answer thesis is because I think those who push it forward are concerned about legitimacy. I think that's the underlying problem, that people think if there aren't right answers here, then judges are making it up, and that's illegitimate. And so that's the reason I focus on the right answer thesis. And Dworkin himself says if judges are exercising their discretion as Hart characterizes it, forgetting about the passage that I quoted, unfairness and democratic legitimacy are threatened. So I take that as motivation for trying to restore the legitimacy of discretionary decision making, and pointing out, as I do in the first part of the paper, that I continue to think that whether there is metaphysically, if you like, a right answer is irrelevant. Because we don't know in any case whether there is one and what it could possibly be. All we can do, and here I'm with Dworkin. You marshal your arguments, and and if somebody says, "Well, I think that's wrong," then the response is, "Okay, give me your argument, and we'll argue it out."
Sandra?
Thank you very much for your paper. I really found it very sound, the 8 conditions. And I would like to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more in this idea of the task of judges to emulate the original position, and in the light that they have to resort to information, they need this information to decide, and what would be the point in which they really are in that the closest point for that position.
Original position.
And the other question is regarding the neutral aspiration, and how, given the wide range of conceptions of the good in a community, it is a minimal requirement of neutrality, and if it is close to this idea of incompleted theorized agreements to reach an answer.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't want to hitch my wagon too much to the public reason debate. If I've got you right in part of what you said, and about the controversial. There's so many conceptions of the good and so on. I guess you're asking, are you going to be able to find any neutral starting point? Is that the idea? Yeah. I see public reason. It's problematic in all kinds of ways. And the critiques of the public reason position are legion. I mean, there's so many of them, and with many of the critiques, I stand in agreement. But what I take from the public reason approach is the good faith attempt to try to come up with reasons that addresses the concerns of the other side, and that can be presented as a solution that's acceptable to us in the conditions of uncertainty and disagreement, and the need to come together under common standards. So it's that spirit of the public reasoning that I seek to capture, and that I think this tries to do. Now, someone comes along and says, "Well, look at their public reasons are never neutral, and what about religious reasons?" And I mean, I agree with all that. What I'm most interested in, as I said, is the attitude that judges take toward their decision making, their attempt to address in as neutral and non-arbitrary a way as they can the situation at hand. The original position. I just mentioned that because I've always been intrigued by the idea that what Hare and Kant were trying to get at, which was essentially moral judgment requires a kind of impartiality, that if you accept a reason for this particular case, you're committed to that being a good reason in any other similar case. That kind of forces you to be impartial in your moral judgments, because as Hare pointed out, you have to entertain hypotheticals in which you are the one who are going to be on the losing end of applying that reason in a particular case. So you can imagine, the positions are switched, and you're the one now you're the one who's going to be the victim, and your current victim is the one who's going to be using the reason to justify treating you in a particular way. So that kind of impartiality that I think is behind the Kantian maxim and the Hare maxim that I'm trying to capture in condition 4 is also one I think that Rawls was trying to get at with the original position. Now, the details are different. It's a different kind of device, but it's trying to get at the same idea, that instead of forcing you to imagine yourself in the other person's position and subject to the same maxim upon which you are now attempting to act in a way that might adversely affect some other person, Rawls strips us of all our particular knowledge about where we're going to be once the veil is lifted. That's another way of forcing you to be impartial, to act on reasons that you would be willing to accept as applicable to you if you ended up, on the losing end when the veil is lifted. So I say that this condition that judges should base their decisions on general principles that extend beyond the case, and that hypothetically could impact them later on. that will help to ensure the kind of impartiality that these three characters were getting at. The complication comes when Rawls doesn't allow for any particular information about the society in which the contractors are going to find themselves when the veil is lifted. But when judges make decisions, they have to know a lot more details about the society, its constitutional practices and its commitments and so on and so forth. That departs a long way from the kind of, a lot more gets through the veil, if you like, than on the Rawlsian account. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We have one more question, Noel.
So I'm, as you know, very sympathetic to the project, the whole project. A little bit skeptical as well, but very sympathetic to it.
Oh, I remember something about quicksand. Right?
Yes. and actually, I mean, the 8 desiderata of that you put, which are definitely procedural, but I don't know if it's a played out process in itself. I would really like to see how you'd apply this 8 desiderata in actual hard cases and how that would work out and things like that. I'm looking forward to the future work in which you do that. So then I'll be thoroughly convinced about your project. But I have a different question. And as in Hickey, I couldn't help but think about Fuller while you were explaining the fact that it's 8 conditions, the fact that
That's
they are all
totally accidental. I hadn't even thought of that.
yeah, and that they are procedural as well, and they're not content-based. And I would like to push a little bit further that Fuller connection and ask if you would be willing to say that maybe we could call these 8 ways to fail to make law under on hard cases under constitutional charters. And by that I mean, would you be willing to say that if a judge does not follow that procedure, would his decision be an invalid decision? Would it not count as law? Or would that depend on whether or not the 8 conditions are built into the rule of recognition?
I'm still a positivist.
Yeah, so they have to be built into the rule of recognition, right? Yeah.
Well, no, this is
It's legitimate, but
this is a political. I mean, this is a moral position I'm putting forward.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying this is the way it should be.
Okay.
Now, what happens if how'd that end up there?
it was probably my fault.
Oh, it was your fault.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'll
that's
put-
okay. Good.
I'll
Zeus
put
is
the 8
fine.
conditions there.
Yeah, but in cases in which these 8 conditions are built into the law, then
Oh, if it's
yeah.
built right into
Yeah,
the law,
yeah.
then perhaps, yeah. Then I might be happy with that. That'd be part of the rules of adjudication, if
Yeah.
you like. I might be willing to bite there.
Mm-hmm.
But just as 8 conditions that I'm arguing would be enough to establish legitimacy. I'm not. You guys are trying to push me in the direction of people I don't want to be associated with all morning here. I don't want to go that far for sure.
Okay.
Okay. And can I just say one
Sure.
final thing? You're all picking up on the fact that, okay, this sounds like Fuller, this sounds like Dworkin, this sounds, it sounds like Wallachau, yes. As I said in Inclusive Legal Positivism in my book, I genuinely believe that philosophical theories almost always get at some part of the truth. And ultimately what you try to do, and this is what I tried to do in Inclusive Positivism, and what I'm trying to do here, I guess, between Dworkin and Hart and Fuller and so on, is take the truth that I find in each one of those theories and come up with what I think is something closer to the truth. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's the way we should proceed, and I think that's the way philosophy generally does proceed. People start with stark positions. They look really different, and then when they elaborate them and try to answer each other, they get closer and closer, and then it gets to the point where you don't even know what the differences are anymore. That happens a lot, and this might be one of them. I don't know, but I'm not embarrassed to take insight from Dworkin. I'm not embarrassed to take insight from Fuller, from Emer, and from others. And no, so I'll just leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much. Muchas gracias a todos.